Welcome, and thank you all for joining today's Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Please note that today's call is being recorded, and currently all of our attendees are muted to reduce background noise. There will be opportunity for questions throughout today's call. If you'd like to ask a question, you can press the raise hand icon on WebEx located at the bottom of your participants panel. If you have technical questions regarding technical issues on WebEx, you can please send those technical questions through the WebEx chat. With that, I will now formally begin today's call and turn the call over to Dr. Ben Hobbs, MSc Chair. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Silas, and welcome everybody. I am very much looking forward to this discussion. One issue is extremely topical, and there's a lot to learn in a short period of time, and recommendations to be made. And then the other issue is one that we've been talking about for quite a while, and for which there's new relevant data and ideas. So I think that's a great mix. Before we start, I'd like to introduce the others who are joining us from the MSc side and the staff side. So from the MSc, of course, we have Dr. Scott Harvey and Jim Bushnell and myself, who are the MSc members. And from the ISO staff, Milosh Bosanak, James Lynn, Amelia Blanc, Shami Davis, George Angelidis, I believe, Guillermo Bautista Alderete, Anna McKenna, Becky Robinson. Is there anybody else that are on the line or in the room that I've missed?
Yes. Fatima Al-Battar and Hillary Staber.
Okay, that's great. All right, so what we'll now proceed to the agenda, and the first part of this agenda is, of course, as always, to take public comment or questions on any issues aside from those that we'll be addressing later in the agenda. If you have comments on those issues, I'd like you to hold those until we get to those items. So what you can do now is queue up on the phone lines. Please do not submit questions via the chat because we tend to miss those. It's best to instead queue up on the phones, and that way we won't miss you and we'll get you in order. So Silas, can you see if there's anybody lined up who would like to make a question or a comment at this time?
If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can press the raise hand icon at the bottom of your participants panel. You may need to open your participants panel first, and then the raise hand icon will be right at the bottom under all the names. At this time, we do not have any hands up in the queue.
Okay, I'm sure that the audience will make up for their relative tranquility later on. I'm looking forward to that. Okay, so we're going to go on to the first of the two major agenda items. The first one being the topical and very fast-moving one on EDAM congestion revenue allocation. So first we have a presentation by Milosh and James from the staff, and we'll follow that with a presentation by Scott Harvey from the MSc. And we have up to roughly 2.5 hours for this agenda item, after which we'll break for lunch at 12:30 Pacific time or thereabouts, and reassembling at 1:30 for about an hour and a half for a discussion of congestion revenue rights. So at this point, James and Milosh, I'd welcome you to the virtual podium.
Good morning, and thank you very much, MSc members. We're going to brief you on a new and expedited stakeholder initiative on the EDAM congestion revenue allocation. I would certainly appreciate your insights and feedback, since this is a topic that's moving fairly quickly, as you'll see. I'm going to provide a bit of context and background on the topic, how it arose, what the issue is, a bit about how the current FERC-approved design works on EDAM congestion revenue allocation, and then introduce what we call a transitional alternative that we put forward for stakeholder feedback, and how it works. And lastly, then we'll have a more complex example to walk through more holistically the effects and the comparison between the status quo and this transitional alternative that we introduced regarding congestion revenue allocation. So it'll be a fairly broad discussion, but by all means, as we go forward, feel free to stop us for any questions, and I'll pause at discrete points as well to make sure that we can answer your questions. If we move to the next slide, please. Just a little bit context and background. As you may know, not last year, now it's December of 23, FERC approved the EDAM policy design and the EDAM tariff, including the congestion revenue allocation mechanism under which the ISO as market operator allocates and distributes congestion revenues between EDAM balancing areas. Under the design, the congestion revenues that the market operator allocates to the entity then can sub-allocate under the terms of its tariff, its open access tariff to its customers. PacifiCorp is similar to the EIM, is the first EDAM participant, and they worked last year over the summer or a few months developing revisions to its open access transmission tariff to implement the EDAM and support their EDAM launch in May of next year, May 2026. And PacifiCorp filed those OAT revisions with FERC in January of this year, and they sought a decision by May 16th of this year as well. And as part of that FERC proceeding, commenters submitted comments on the PacifiCorp OAT revisions and raised concerns with the EDAM mechanism for allocation of congestion revenues from the market operator to the participating balancing areas. And the concern was with how the market operator allocates that, and particularly associated with how congestion revenues associated with parallel flow effects on an adjoining system, how those congestion revenues are allocated between the EDAM balancing areas. And in response to those comments in that proceeding, the ISO was a party, and we submitted in our answer a commitment to launch an expedited stakeholder initiative to create more understanding on the current design on that EDAM congestion revenue allocation, but also evaluate potential transitional mechanisms for the allocation of those congestion revenues. And I'll touch a bit more on this in the coming slides. If we go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit of an overview on the existing design, and then we'll look to illustrate it a few slides down the line. But under the current FERC-approved design for EDAM congestion revenue allocation, congestion revenues are allocated to the EDAM balancing area in which the internal transmission constraint is located. And again, this is consistent with how that congestion revenue allocation is allocated in the EIM today. The market operator collects those congestion revenues and allocates them to the respective EDAM entities based on that method. Where the congestion revenue, where the constraint is located, that's where the associated congestion revenues flow. The EDAM entity then that receives those congestion revenues determines under its open access transmission tariff how to further sub-allocate those revenues amongst its transmission customers. And PacifiCorp proposed in its filed OAT revisions seeking to provide a level of congestion hedge for transmission customers that are exercising their transmission rights, seeking to protect at least partially from some of these congestion costs for those parties that are exercising their firm OAT transmission rights. And in the graphic there, you can see the two-tier allocation that PacifiCorp proposed. The congestion revenues that they collect from the market operator, they would first look to allocate to transmission customers that are exercising their firm OAT transmission rights that are of a monthly or annual duration. And they have to exercise those rights to receive an allocation of these congestion revenues. And secondarily, then there's whatever remains is allocated within PacifiCorp to measure demand, load, and exports. If we can go to the next slide. So then, what's the issue and the scope of the initiative? So the initiative here is narrowly focused on how congestion revenues are allocated as a result of parallel flow effects across the EDAM footprint based on those flow-based transmission constraints that may bind within an EDAM balancing area. How those revenues are distributed by the market operator between the EDAM entities based upon either where those congestion revenues accrue or where the constraint is located. But that's the key essence here of the question, is those congestion revenues associated with parallel flow effects that are accruing in an adjacent EDAM area where the constraint is not located. How are those congestion revenues allocated? And the initiative that we launched seeks to establish a common understanding on the current design and the rationale behind it of how those congestion revenues and why they're allocated to the EDAM area where the constraint is located, but then also introduces, as I noted, a potential transitional alternative that I'll touch here on in the next few slides. The important thing that we do want to note is that the initiative doesn't focus or doesn't seek to address or modify the allocation of what we call transfer revenues. These are revenues that accrue as a result of binding scheduling limits at EDAM interties or at transfer locations between two EDAM areas. But it's really focused on the congestion revenues that impact the congestion component of the LMP associated with transmission constraints internal to the network, to the transmission network. Those are the type of flow-based constraints, for example, that may bind within an EDAM balancing area and the accruing congestion revenues that result from that. If we go to the next slide. So just to familiarize you a little bit with some of the constraint and transmission system modeling in the EIM, but also extends to the EDAM as well. So the ISO market utilizes a full network model to model the entire transmission system within an EDAM balancing area. And we also model associated transmission constraints that may occur or that may bind within a particular EDAM balancing area. This is unique to each EDAM area, each transmission system. There are different transmission constraints and transmission limits that may need to be respected and modeled in the market to ensure that the market can manage those as well. And the full network model then includes that information, the transmission system, the transmission constraints, the modeling of the generation and associated generation constraints. And that full network model then supports the calculation of the locational marginal prices at each pricing location within that market model. And in the EIM today, supported by this full network model, we calculate LMPs in the real-time market across the EIM footprint, across the 22 balancing areas. Today, in the day-ahead market, we only calculate those LMPs within the ISO balancing area because that's the only day-ahead market. But once the EDAM launches, then we will also have those day-ahead prices, those day-ahead LMPs, constraints, also in the day-ahead time frame in other EDAM balancing areas as well. And it's important to note that the marginal congestion component of the LMP at each pricing location is sensitive to the transmission constraints that are modeled in that full network model, because now we're modeling the EDAM footprint effectively as one single footprint that the market optimizes, as one single interconnected transmission grid where we model those constraints, and a constraint in one EDAM balancing area can have an effect on the congestion component in another EDAM balancing area due to the nature of that interconnectivity of the transmission system and of those parallel flow effects where energy flows across the path of least resistance. And so within the full network model and associated with each constraint, we modeled that electrical effectiveness of the pricing location to the physical constraint based on distribution factors, or what we call also shift factors, such that a constraint in one area is price sensitive to potentially other pricing locations across the footprint, and it can affect the MCC component of that LMP. If we go to the next slide. So then just to illustrate the issue here more simplistically, and then later we'll have James do a more complex example with multiple balancing areas and how the settlements flow. But just to illustrate this more simplistically, assume that there's a transmission constraint in a neighboring EDAM balancing area that has an effect on the congestion component of the LMPs in the Pacificor balancing area. So a neighboring area has the constraint, and some of those pricing effects associated with the constraint are felt at pricing locations in the Pacificor balancing area. And the crux of the issue is, as has been raised by commenters, is that a transmission customer in Pacificor that may be exercising their transmission rights, let's say here to export from the Pacificor area, they have transmission right from the generator to an export location. If they were to exercise that transmission right, they may be exposed to additional costs as a result of these congestion pricing impacts and parallel flow effects. They may be exposed to costs that they may not be exposed to today. And so in this example, we have a generator seeking to export out of Pacificor, and there's an LMP at the generator and an LMP at the export location. And those LMPs are impacted by that constraint in another balancing area. It impacts the congestion component of the LMP at these locations. The transmission customer is going to be paid the LMP at the generator, and they're going to be charged the LMP at the export location. They're going to be paid $20, and they're going to be charged $25. Thus, they're exposed to a $5 net cost difference due to those parallel flow effects associated with the congestion cost impacts from a constraint in a neighboring balancing area. And so the key question is, what happens with the $5 of congestion revenue? The market operator is going to collect that $5 net difference as congestion revenue for distribution between the EDAM balancing areas. And so the key question is that $5 congestion revenue, how should that be allocated among the balancing areas? The customer is going to be exposed to that net cost. The market operator is going to collect that net $5 difference. The market operator is revenue neutral, so we have to allocate those $5. Which EDAM area receives that $5 of congestion revenue? So if we go to the next slide. So under the current design for EDAM congestion revenue allocation, this is the FERC-approved design that they approved in December of 23. Under the existing design, congestion revenues flow to the EDAM balancing area in which the transmission constraint is located, that contributed and that led to those congestion revenues. And this is consistent with the EIM today. And so this includes allocation of congestion revenues that materialize in the source balancing area, but also those congestion revenues resulting from parallel flow effects in the neighboring balancing area. Because a transmission constraint in one area can impact the LMP at pricing locations in neighboring EDAM areas. And the rationale for this design that's currently in the EIM and was presented to FERC as well is that type of a congestion revenue allocation, where congestion revenues flow to the area where the constraint is located, it supports the allocation because that balancing area where the constraint is located bears those effects of redispatch, but also managing the reliability effects within that balancing area. The constraint is in their area, the redispatch predominantly occurs there, and there may be also additional actions that balancing area may need to take in their independent role as the reliability entity for that balancing area. They may need to take additional actions to manage the effects of that constraint within that area. So that's the current design. If we go to the next slide, this now talks about the transitional alternative approach that we introduced for consideration, which is that based on the stakeholder feedback and the concerns that they expressed associated with the OAT transmission customers being exposed to potential costs that they may not be exposed to today as part of migrating to EDAM, the transitional alternative looks at congestion revenue allocations with parallel flow effects and says, we're going to allocate those to the area where that congestion revenue accrues, where that revenue is collected, not to the area where the constraint is located. And under this transitional approach, then congestion revenues would be allocated to the balancing area where those congestion revenues accrued or were collected, irrespective of the location of the transmission constraint. The EDAM entity would be allocated those congestion revenues, and they then can support providing a greater congestion hedge to their transmission customers that may be exercising their transmission rights. We see this issue being a more of where does the money flow associated with these congestion revenues. So this transitional alternative has no impact on how resources are dispatched or how the market solves congestion, but really tries to address the settlement distribution effect of congestion revenues. And on this next slide, I'm going to illustrate that with that $5 example just to make sure that we capture the concept. Again, just to set it up, there's a constraint in the neighboring balancing area, in the CAISO. There's a transmission constraint. And because of the interconnectivity of the transmission systems, the parallel flow effects, some pricing locations within PacifiCorp may have an impact on the congestion component of the LMP as a result of the constraint in CAISO. And in this case, again, we have the same example of a transmission customer trying to exercise their rights to export from PacifiCorp from that generator to the export location. The price difference is $5. The customer is exposed to that $5 charge net cost, and we have those $5 of congestion revenues. And so how should they be allocated? Under the current EDAM design, the $5 would flow back to the balancing area where the constraint is located. It would flow back to the CAISO. And under the transitional alternative design, the $5 of congestion revenue would flow to the area where that revenue was collected. It would stay or flow back to PacifiCorp. And if it flows back to PacifiCorp, then PacifiCorp can sub-allocate under that two-tier approach that we mentioned before. They can use that $5 that they just received in congestion revenues, and they can sub-allocate it to that transmission customer that exercised their OAT transmission rights and effectively provide a greater or more complete congestion hedge to the customer that otherwise would have been exposed to a $5 difference. So that's the contrast in these two approaches. Maybe I can pause here just to see if there are any questions, and then I can move to a couple of other slides.
Meelis, this is Scott Arby. I mean, I think one point we need to make about this is that if the transmission customer knows that it's going to get $5 back, it has an incentive to be dispatched even if its costs are $24 or $23. So it has an incentive to self-schedule. I mean, that's one of the things we have to balance in this discussion is the effect on the incentives of to participate in the dispatch, because if you know that by self-scheduling, you effectively will get paid $23 rather than being back down to 20, you'd want to self-schedule. So that's something to keep in mind.
That's right. That's right. And under the EDAM design, the way that a party exercises their transmission rights, it has to exercise those rights through a self-schedule in the market. Transmission customer would register their rights with the market operator so that we know they have a firm point-to-point right from the generator to the export location, and then they would have to exercise that right. They would have to self-schedule that transmission. So you're correct. There are some incentives here to self-schedule that generation if they wanted to mitigate that impact of congestion cost exposure.
The only other thing is that the generation and the demand also needs to be balanced. So if it is unbalanced, they're not going to be considered for, potentially getting the hedge back to them.
Under the Pacific or sub-allocation, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, more generally, and I don't know if this is the right time to have this discussion, but if you think about the nodal price is trying to quantify all of the congestion externalities that, you know, injecting power at a given location imposes. And the benefit here is you're capturing those externalities, not just internal to one balancing area, but everybody who's on all the members of EDAM. The way I think of it, it's analogous to taxing for pollution, which is another externality, or forcing them to buy a pollution allowance. And in pollution allowance world, there's an analogous sort of issue about giving away the allowances. And there's concerns about if you give the allowances to the entity that is basically emitting the pollution, scaled to how much pollution they emit, that you're kind of undoing the incentive effect that the price on pollution was supposed to provide in the first place. And so I think the concern here kind of more generally is that if we are awarding back the cost of congestion to the entities that are kind of creating the congestion, that the incentive effects will be diluted or eliminated. And so that has to do, I think, with exactly who is, you know, the residual claimant on this congestion revenue and how much influence they have on their bidding, their scheduling behavior, and so forth. But it is kind of, you know, yes, mechanically, it's not changing how for a given bid the market operations would solve for the solution, but it is potentially affecting the incentives for those bids in the first place. And you know, that's more of an issue if you have an integrated system where the generation and the congestion revenues are kind of housed under one roof.
Yeah.
I actually had this at the risk of a digression. So at the very beginning, you're sort of I'm trying to understand also kind of the status quo, because you know there's inefficiencies in the status quo as well. There's externalities that aren't being maybe properly reflected. But one silly question I have is, okay, you say we do model the full network model even in the day ahead market to some degree, don't we? And I'm trying to remember exactly how this works. I believe we have the underlying electrical characteristics, but maybe we don't enforce any constraints outside of CAISO. But you know, Oasis posts day ahead prices for the entire EIM footprint every day. I'm looking at today's Outlook, which has a whole bunch of prices, you know, all over the West. And I'm just trying to remember exactly how the existing electrical, you know, characteristics are reflected today relative to sort of how we would evolve.
No, you're right. You're right that we do model the full network across the West as part of the full network model, but in areas where there's no day-ahead market, you're right, we're not modeling any kind of constraints. We're also not getting price information. So while I think we externally do post some day-ahead price information outside of the ISO balancing area, I don't think it's an accurate necessarily representation of those prices. I think it's aspects of the functionality that we post, but the actual prices are across the real-time EIM footprint, and then the prices within the ISO balancing in day ahead are reflective of the actual generation component, energy component, the associated congestion impacts based on the constraints that are materializing. But we do model, like you said, the wider West footprint. It's just that we don't model any of those constraints in any of the balancing areas that are not part of the market.
And is there an underlying assumption about injections and withdrawals in those external areas when sort of doing those calculations as well? Or is it just sort of all the actual load and generation is still just internal to CAISO, and we're thinking about how it affects the network?
I think Guillermo and George are probably one of the best people to answer your question, Jim.
Yeah, I don't know, James, and George and Guillermo, if you're on. So.
Yeah, and I can take it offline too. But I do think, to the extent it's germane to this discussion, I'm trying to get a feel for, how are actual parallel flows sort of dealt with today? And how does joining EDAM change that in one direction or the other? And so, which represents more of a shift from the status quo and those sorts of ideas. But yeah, I don't want to distract from this discussion too much in that direction. So I'll try to get one.
I can give a high level that my understanding, and so what ends up happening the day ahead, the ISO is the reference bus for all of the pricing, and then we look at the import-export bids as well as telemetry, not telemetry, we have another input, I think it's telemetry, but I'm not positive, that gives us a representation of what the injections are and withdrawals across the footprint, but it's not based upon generation by generation. It's a much larger representation, so that we're able to account for the loop flow. And since we aren't having any bids, and that's why the ISO is the reference point for setting those LMPs, you're basically looking to see what the power flow of all of the imports and export is across the external system and how it reflects from the ISO marginal energy price. And that's how we end up setting the LMP.
Okay.
Jim, this is George Angelidis. Just to add a little bit on that really quick to get your question, I think, fully answered. We do have a process for estimating external schedules today. We get the schedules from the reliability coordinator interface we have with participants outside with the balancing authority areas, and we do have demand forecasts for those areas. So we have an approximate way of representing all the injections in the full network model. And this is not changing going to EDAM, except for the fact that some of these balancing authority areas now become EDAM BAA, so we don't need to do that for them because we have bids and we will be scheduling these resources. But anything outside, we estimate the schedule. So when we solve the power flow in the solution, we do have a good approximation of what are these loop flows or parallel flows, as you call them here. And they are they're consuming some of the transmission capability in the network. They're in the power flow solution. So if they cause any congestion, we resolve that by obviously doing congestion management on the resources that we have bids. These are the resources that participate in the market. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. That's helpful.
Okay. So if we go to the next slide, I'll be done here in 3 slides, and then I think we can go to illustrate this for you in a more complex and more realistic multi-balancing area example. But just to give you a sense of some of the questions that we're asking here for stakeholder input in the context of the transitional alternative that we put forward for stakeholder feedback, I think a key question is the level of or the extent of application of that transitional approach in the day ahead versus the real-time market. I think from our initial perspective, I think the transitional approach will be applied in the day ahead market, not necessarily extended to the real time, such that in real time, the congestion revenues would still flow back to the area where the constraint is located. And part of that is that extending that transitional alternative design to the real-time market would now have a potentially much larger impact across 22 balancing areas rather than just a couple of EDAM areas that are launching into EDAM and that we're going to monitor during that transitional period. But also because a key driver for this is the desire from the EDAM entities to provide a congestion hedge initially for parties that are exercising their transmission rights. And so that congestion hedge in other markets has traditionally been available in the day-ahead markets, not necessarily extended to real-time. And there are also some important differences between the real-time and the day-ahead market. The EIM is a real-time market managing deviations from day-ahead to real-time. And then there's some other nuances where in the EIM, there's base scheduling, of generation that's not settled through the market, and that can also contribute to parallel flows, but you can't necessarily settle that with that generation. And so in our minds, at least, you know, an initial thought for stakeholder feedback that we put forward is, you know, if we do move towards that transitional alternative approach where congestion revenues stay with the area where they accrue, that apply only day ahead and not change the real-time allocation that the wider West is used to here in the EIM. And that gives us time to then work on this alternative transitional design and a longer-term solution to this particular topic that if we switch to the next slide, that'll touch on. So why is this alternative transitional, or at least as we're framing it as a transitional alternative design? Well, I think EDAM design on this congestion revenue allocation, we see that as evolving under either of the approaches, whether we stay with the status quo or move to this other alternative. It's an evolutionary design informed by operational market experience. The EDAM design is not static, but especially as we learn and based on our EIM experience in that first year or so of operation, there probably will be things that we're going to need to consider and evolve, including this congestion revenue allocation topic. But more substantively than that, I think there's a recognition that the congestion revenue allocation under this transitional alternative design, you know, is going to provide a much greater congestion hedge for those parallel flow effects on other systems where maybe the OAT service has not been reserved to effectuate that. It hasn't been reserved on those alternate systems. Transmission service is usually managed by each transmission provider and reserved and tested and evaluated within their own balancing area without necessarily looking at those parallel flow effects and on the adjoining system. And providing that congestion hedge for effects on the other system, you know, may not necessarily align with that OAT service premise where parties have not reserved that service on the other system. But we also think that it's important to consider evolving to those future designs that I think more in line with what we see in transitions with other markets, but also what other markets have established to accommodate and manage those impacts for parties that are selling OAT service. So it'll be important, whatever design we transition to, that it continues to support this unique structure of the EDAM where there's the market operator that operates the market under an EDAM tariff, but each participating balancing area has their own tariff that they can continue to sell transmission service, and it'll be important to evaluate those effects on a long-term basis. If we go to the next slide. So what does it mean then to transition to a longer-term design? And what we would, if we do move forward, depending on stakeholder feedback on this transitional alternative, if we do move forward with it, we would look to monitor and benchmark those parallel flow effects across an incrementally growing EDAM footprint, including monitoring the congestion revenue distribution effects between the balancing area based upon how that congestion effect is materializing associated with parallel flows. And that monitoring can provide some important benchmarking and some important data on where and how that congestion is materializing across that incrementally growing footprint as each balancing area joins at different times. And with each area that joins, there may be different effects on that congestion. And tracking those cost impacts and using that to inform future design. Also giving us a sense of, you know, what's the magnitude of self-scheduling that this kind of impacts, and that will help us inform, or that it fosters, and that will help us also inform the structure of the design and the effects of that on constraints. And we would do this for the first 1 to 2 years of market operations. I don't think we want to necessarily prolong that too much because as more entities join the EDAM, I think that exacerbates some of these issues. So we want to be fairly quick in evaluating and using this data to help inform and hold discussions on where we want to move. But informed by that operational experience and that data that we've gathered, we will launch then a new stakeholder initiative to evaluate that design evolution across a potential spectrum of congestion hedging designs. Not necessarily that we would not consider necessarily going back, but it's where do you evolve this design forward to, and that initiative could start looking at those spectrums in parallel potentially to the gathering and benchmarking of that data in the first 1 to 2 years of market operations. So the transition really is looking at gathering that data based on actual market operational experience and using that to then guide us and inform where do we want to transition to, including consideration within that spectrum of alternatives, moving to some form of potentially financial rights to the extent that market participants want to evaluate that. So let me pause there as well, because the next set of slides deal with a more complex, more realistic multi-balancing area example. But I want to just pause here as well. I know that some of your slides as well, I think we'll look at this transition and some of the history of how others have dealt with it, but also what could a transition look like. And certainly happy to take any questions here before we dive a little bit deeper into an example from James.
That's great. Thanks for these slides. This has been, I'd like to ask just a quick question just for some perspective. So, of course, this is the answer to this will depend the time of the year and time of day and so forth. But in general, are there flow gates within the CAISO footprint that are often highly congested, for which a large fraction of the flow is due to parallel flows from transactions from dispatch outside of the CAISO footprint as opposed to dispatch within the CAISO? I'm wondering whether these parallel flows can sometimes be as much as half or majority of flows and flow gates, or do they tend to be usually pretty small on a percentage basis? And George, I did hear you say that that the ISO is getting better at projecting these parallel flows or loop flows, and so I'm just wondering if how large a problem this is, at least in terms of the megawatts that flow through the more congested flow gates within the CAISO footprint.
No, good question, Ben. Maybe if we still have Guillermo online, maybe Guillermo, if you have, based on what you've seen and your experience, if you may be able to help and identify that. Okay.
Guillermo is listening, but he's not able to speak up at the time. His answer, which is highlighted in the recent CRR analysis, is that this tends to vary from season to season. There are impacts, and we have measured them, and it's not a regular, steady, constant flow.
Right.
Right, I believe with
yeah, I definitely anticipated that this would vary quite a bit, but there are times and places where it's a large fraction, 50% or more, 40%, or is that extremely rare?
I think that's extremely rare, that generally the effects are relatively low. This is a marginal impact.
Okay, and Guillermo has actually published information on that in his studies, so we can refer to that.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay. So if we go to the next slide, let me just set this up for a second, and I'll turn it over to James. But having established now through my simplistic scenario of just what the issue is and where the $5 go, to the risk of not confusing you more, we wanted to share some more realistic multi-balancing area EDAM type of examples where you have more than one constraint binding. There's usually in the market there's multiple constraints binding across different areas that contribute to the congestion price component at different pricing locations. And so we wanted to illustrate what would this look like in a multiple balancing area context and try to contrast what does the settlement look like under the existing design between those balancing areas and then under the transitional alternative. how does that differ based on what's going on the grid between these bands? Where do those parallel flow congestion revenues effectively flow under those more realistic and complex scenarios? So I'll turn it over to James here to walk you through that.
So sorry, guys, before you dive into this, I think I have a question that's probably best asked now versus later. And yeah, it had to do with the transfer limits. So again, coming back to this idea of incentive effects, and we talked about maybe trying to think through the incentives on bidding and scheduling. My understanding is that, like, in terms of the available internal capacity, that's just something that's physically modeled and not sort of the option of any balancing authority to provide. And can you talk through transfer limits then? Are those also something that's established like well in advance, or how are those determined? Who has the sort of authority to set those levels, and how does that change with EDAM membership? Those sorts of questions.
No, that's a great question. Yeah, and so when we're talking about those transfer limits, those are scheduling limits at interties between two EDAM balancing areas. And that could be one or more interties depending on the connectivity between the balancing areas. And under the EDAM, those scheduling limits are set by the EDAM entity. However, the EDAM design effectively makes all of that transmission capability available for optimization. It's not as in the EIM where parties may be able to establish on their own how much they're willing to make available at each intertie, and that varies. In the EDAM, all of that transmission capability, one way or another, becomes available to set that scheduling limit by the EDAM entity on both sides of the transfer point. And what that means is that under the EDAM design, transmission capacity of that intertie that's supporting the resource sufficiency evaluation, that is otherwise also transmission capacity that's been reserved but is left unscheduled, any unsold ATC or available transfer capability of that intertie is made available, along with any transmission customers that may be exercising their transmission rights. That's also accounted for and acknowledged within the total amount of transmission capability at that intertie. So one way or another, the total transmission capability of that interface is made available on both sides, subject to any outage reductions, or in certain instances, the EDAM entity has the ability to manage any transmission capability that's under the methodology are associated with margins, like reliability margins or anything like that. That can vary. But beyond that, the full transfer capability at each side is made available to support optimization, and that's identified to us and notified to the market operator by the EDAM entity.
Great. Yeah, I'm trying to remember, within the RSC framework, there was a discussion about a, like an aggregate export or import, I think it's export constraint, that would not necessarily be transmission linked. And I forget what the details were, but
that's right.
I'm trying to think how that overlaps with this.
That's right, and that's a little bit of that's a little bit separate concept of how much transmission capability you have available to support giants. So that's called a net export transfer constraint. To the extent the balancing area wants to avail themselves of that, it creates a limit potentially to how much generation in total can be exported to support transfer from a balancing area. But it doesn't affect the transfer limit at the location between the EDAM areas. Just sets the limit to how much can a balancing area export to support transfers from its internal generation. So the transfer limit could still support wheel-through transfers, for example. The balancing area were to limit its export transfers, the transmission capability still could support wheel-through transfers.
Okay. Got it. Thanks. That's helpful.
Okay, if we go to the next slide, I'll turn it over to James to now walk through his examples. And by all means, these are more complex, so James is going to pause at different spots, but also please feel free to ask any questions as well.
Good morning, MSC members. As I walk through the slides, I want to preface this discussion as, yes, they are a little bit more realistic, but given our time constraint, I was not able to build a solver. So these examples are based upon trying to get my best representation of what the pricing and flow would be in order to demonstrate how the marginal cost congestion is distributed today under the current design and how it potentially could transition under the transitional measure. So there may be some inconsistency once I do build a solver, but just want to level set that expectation. Now, these examples, I'm going to start out, we have a 4 BAA area example. That's what the footprint is made of. In order to make this a simplified solution, we're going to make the assumption that all 4 BAs pass the resource efficiency test. There is no net export constraint. The solver says that none of the BAA's transfer constraints are binding, so they're all within their transfer limits, so that sets the marginal energy cost the same across the entire footprint. We have a single constraint that's binding in BAA, and that constraint is binding from a south to north direction, and therefore it's creating a shadow price at this constraint that impacts all the LMP across the market based upon their effectiveness on that constraint. I've developed 2 examples. One is prevailing flow, and in the prevailing flow, the supply is going in the direction of the constraint. So the constraint's binding south to north. Overall, the flow of energy is from generation to demand is from south to north. I also have developed a counterflow example where I do have some generation that's being dispatched that is going in the opposite direction of the constraint. So it's going to be flowing from a north to south direction. And so as I walk through these examples, I'll do it relatively, I won't go number by number, but we'll do a little bit on a higher level as what being dispatched and what the settlement is. And then we'll do a comparison of how the congestion is distributed today and then how it would be distributed if we adopted the transitional measure. We can move to the next slide. So the first example we're going to walk through is the prevailing flow. In the prevailing flow, we in essence have energy from BAA-B that is being dispatched to meet load in BAC and BAD. BAA, even though it has transfers within going across its system, the net supply within the system is equal to the net demand within the system. So in essence, we have prevailing flow externally, which is flowing from south to north. Now, in my example, for BAA, I have a total of 6,000 megawatts of generation being dispatched to meet 6,000 megawatts of load. 5,000 of the load is in the north, 1,000 is in the south. So I have 1,200 dispatched in the north to meet both the load in the north as well as to support the transfer from BAA to BAC. And then I have 4,800 megawatts in the south to meet the load in the south of 1,000 megawatts, but also that's being offset by a 200 megawatt transfer from BAB to BAA. Now this results in the north being for the BAA, the overall settlement of the supply is 97,200. And then the overall settlement of load is $215,000. And now with the transfer, since they're only settling at the marginal energy price, they net out. So that leaves for BAA an imbalance of $117,800. Now that is a collection of congestion within BAA from the overall settlement of the generation load and transfers within BAA. For BAB, we have 1,000 megawatts of generation being dispatched. 600 of that is to meet its internal load. 200 is a direct transfer between BAB and BAC. 200 is a transfer between BAB and BAA, but ultimately, from a BAA's perspective, the net transfer is zero because it in essence looks like it's wheeling through BAA. This results in an overall settlement of generation within BAB of 13,600 and then load of 8,400. With the overall settlement of the transfers, we come down to a net position of an over collection of $2,400, which is associated with congestion settlement within that BAA. BAC is been dispatched 100 megawatts of generation to meet 300 megawatts of load, so 100 of that. We have a 100 megawatt Oak contract that was coming from BAB, so we have 100 megawatts coming to serve that load. And then the last 100 megawatts has also been from economic generation with BAB to serve load in BAC. The remaining 200 megawatts that is coming from BAB that has gone direct to BAC or wheeled through, that is continuing on to serve load in BAD. So for BAC, the ultimate settlement for that BAA is I have $4,000 being paid to the generation in BAC. I have $12,000 charged to load within that balancing authority area, and the net result is $4,000 of collection of congestion revenue from BAC. And then we go look to BAD, there's 8,000 megawatt the settlement for the load, there's a $4,000 settlement for the transfer. If you look at the congestion, it's a net difference of $4,000, so we have collected $4,000 in BAD to also based upon the constraint. So that's congestion revenue. Now, how is this distributed? If we go to the next slide, under the current marginal cost congestion distribution, it is being distributed to the BAA where the constraint resides. So all of the congestion in that prevailing flow example is being settled with the BAA because that is the constraint that's binding, and all of these BAA's solution shows that it is has collective congestion, or they cause the congestion, and therefore needs to be paid to or charged out or paid to the BAA, in which the constraint was binding. So the total is $128,200, and then so BAA is going to get a payment of $128,200. Under the transitional approach, we are not going to be allocating it to the BAA where the constraint resides, but instead it's going to be allocated to the BAA where the congestion was collected. So again, the total amount that needs to be distributed is $128,200. Now, if we look at where it was collected and then paid out to the BAs where it's collected, you'll see that $117,800 was being paid to BAA, $2,400 is going to be paid to BAB, $4,000 is going to be paid to BAC, and $4,000 is going to be paid to BAD. Now I'm going to stop here because I'm going to open up for some questions.
I found this really, during the week, I was shooting a bunch of emails that basically were best answered by read the example more carefully. And so I found this helpful for that. But one kind of in the weeds question I had here was, had to do with what's going on with the assumed swing bus, both in your model and how this would work in a multi-BAA EDAM setting as well. Because this I found helpful just in terms of trying to think through, okay, what are the parallel flows if it goes from A, I forget which is which, but if it goes from A to B and then impacts, a third party C, and how you divvy up that impact. But it does seem like that depends upon the assumed swing buses here too. I don't know if there's a simple answer to that question, but what is going on in this model and how representative of that is of what EDAM would do?
James, let me provide a hand here if you allow me. This is George Angelidis. I believe, Jim, your question is what's the reference
Yeah,
that we use to calculate the shift factors, correct?
yeah,
Yeah, so so the reference that we use in all our markets is the distributed load in the market footprint. So for EDAM, it's going to be the distributed load across all EDAM balancing authority areas. Now, the property of the shift factors being linear is such that the selection of the reference is not relevant if you're looking at balanced transactions across the grid, right? Then the reference drops out from that calculation. So that's why the congestion revenue that you collect from a balanced transaction, balanced source and sink, the reference doesn't change the congestion revenue on that. And also, it doesn't affect any hedging instrument like CRRs, for example. If you're looking at an LMP at isolation, just that LMP, then the marginal congestion component of that LMP is with the reference. So if you're looking at an isolation or any kind of unbalanced transaction, then the reference does matter, right? Because it really determines how the separation between the marginal energy cost and the marginal congestion component happens. But if you take them in pairs, balance source to balance sink, then the reference really doesn't matter. It drops out from the calculations. I hope this provides a little bit of clarity to your question. Otherwise, let me know if you want
yeah,
to.
yeah. I think so, but in this case, when I think of the balance, it's sort of like we've got two BAAs and they're each collecting some congestion rent because in each BAA, and I'm talking about the ones that are party to the actual transaction, not the one experiencing the parallel flow. And in a sense, they're each collecting the difference between kind of their local sink and their local source. And so there's kind of like four nodes in what you were referring to as sort of the balance. And in terms of the divvying up between, say, BAA and BAAB, I'm curious as to whether the choice of the reference node does affect that. Because yeah, overall between A and B, it is all balanced, but there's also this sort of split of the total congestion between those two BAAs as well.
I see what you're asking. Yeah, okay. So yeah, if its balancing authority area is balanced, then the congestion revenue that you collect doesn't matter on the reference selection. Now, if it's unbalanced, meaning you have transfers in and transfers out, obviously, as I said earlier, if you're looking at the unbalanced portions, the selection of the reference does matter, and that is the reason, among other reasons, that we select a reference that is kind of neutral, doesn't give a leg to one BAA over the other. It's just a distributed load over the entire market footprint. I don't know if that answer is satisfactory.
Yeah, no, it does. I'm not sure what to make of it either, really. But yeah, and if I heard you right, then also one kind of consequence of EDAM expansion or of EDAM itself is going to be that the reference node will expand from being just California distributed load to all EDAM all EDAM load nodes.
That is correct.
Is that correct?
As James mentioned, we're working on, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm parallel tasks working on a solver that will use a generalized network with balancing authority areas. And the it actually uses a network with the 6 factor. So when we get this up and running with examples and we'll be able to discuss it at some point, you'll be able to see how the effect of the reference comes into the picture.
Okay. All right. Thanks for
But
and-
just to clarify, also remember that the congestion rent, so the ship factors times the shadow price of the constraint. So it's gonna move around depending on where you're calculating it to, but on the other hand, it's gonna net out for generation and load. But also, we're all talking about the DC load approximation. In an AC model, the decomposition between losses and congestion rents does change.
If we could stop for a second, I see there's a raised hand and we can take a question.
Hi, this is Doug Boccignone from Flynn Resource Consultants for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I just had one thing that struck me about this example compared to some of the previous ones in other meetings is it looks to me like this constraint, the limit is implied is 4,000 megawatts. And it seems like what's missing from this conversation is what's happening if there's been congestion revenue rights allocated or auctioned across that full 4,000 megawatts. Because it seems like from the load and generation side within BAA, you end up collecting enough congestion revenues under the alternative approach. But that ignores whether you have an obligation to settle 4,000 megawatts of CRRs. It seems like there's going to be a 200 megawatt shortfall for covering that CRR obligation for the 200 megawatts of load that is flowing through.
Right, that's right, Doug. I mean, that's if they'd, and there is an impact even if you don't have CRRs. I mean, 200 megawatts of transfer capability are being used by loop flow. So there's a loss of the ability to load in the north with cheaper generation in the south. And that's intrinsic in the impact of loop flow on a constraint. And you're also right that if we turn it into transmission rights and we've sold all 4,000, then there's going to be a congestion rate shortfall. And this is where, this analysis ties into what Guillermo was doing. And the auction may model the amount of loop flows that are expected, but if the amount of loop flows vary from hour to hour and period to period, it's hard to model it.
Yeah, well, I think it is important to note, I guess we'll talk about this more this afternoon, but I think the ISO has the ability to model loop flow in the allocation and auction, but I do not believe they actually do. They assume zero loop flow in those markets.
So Doug, the CRR model does model loop flow. It uses, branch groups and so on to do the modeling of loop flow, but it does take into consideration loop flow in the CRR model.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that. I wasn't aware
Right, but of course the granularity is different. The point I was making is the loop flow may be very different over the month at different hours, and for seasonal auctions it might be different over the month. So it's very difficult for the CAISO to perfectly model loop flows
of course
in an auction relative to the IFM.
That is
model
correct.
is in air quotes, yeah.
All right, given
Thank you.
I've been informed that we're short on time. I do have a second example I can walk through if needed be, but I would like to open it up to move on to other discussions, and if needed, I can come back to this example.
Scott's presentation.
So I think it's going to Scott's presentation.
Yeah.
Fine. Why don't you go to the next slide? And the next slide is just talking about the topics. I'm going to first talk about, sort of continue what we've just been talking about, the impact of loop flow and pricing, and then talk about market design considerations, and then talk a little bit about EDM evolution. So go to the next slide. And generally, loop flow congestion costs we need as a big picture item are small relative to total congestion charges, but they could be material for some particular flows. And that's what Jim brought up earlier And we don't have really good data about exactly how much loop flow in megawatts there were at different times of day and year on these constraints. So we know it's variable. It's also important, the point at the bottom, to keep in mind that loop flow is not just about intertie transactions. It can also be impacted by dispatch or generation within a balancing area, and there may be particular balancing areas in the west where there are going to be significant loop flow impacts because of the distance between their loads and generation. And also some balancing areas may be more impacted by other balancing areas because of their configuration. And it also, at the bottom, we have to remember that loop flows can also be created by the Western EIM dispatch or the EDAM dispatch. Just making dispatching generation to meet market load could create flows over other systems. So it's not just a matter of OAT schedules. Go ahead to the next slide. Another consideration back is that loop flows are an inherent feature of the grid. Just because we have an interconnected grid and power flows from source to sink over all the paths, that we're inherently going to get a loop flow. It isn't because anybody's an evil person. It's just an inherent fact of the benefits of interconnection, which increase transfer capability because we have much lower post-contingency flows, but they mean that we have loop flows. And the WEAM dispatch, as I said, can also create flows on other balancing areas when we just dispatch generation to meet load. So it doesn't come about as a result necessarily of any kind of OAT schedule. Go on to the next slide. And this follows from what we were just talking about, that when there's no material congestion on adjacent systems, the loop flows don't make any difference because there's zero, no transfer capability is reduced. But when there's congestion, as we were talking about in that last example, the effect of loop flows over a congested interface is to reduce the transfer capability available to meet native load with the cheap generation on one side instead of the expensive generation on the other. And the WEAM dispatch at present takes account of that impact in pricing. So it prices the impact of generation in one balancing area that flows around and reduces the transfer capability in another generation by using up that transfer capability on the constraint. And I'll illustrate that in a couple simple examples. This is sort of redundant of what James just walked through, but go to the next slide. I'll talk about it a little bit differently. So this is the kind of example James had. We have the scheduled flow from BA to B, or it could just be WEAM market dispatch or EDAM dispatch. And some of it flows around on the path through balancing area C over a constraint, and it uses up some of the space on the constraint, just as in James' example, where you had to back down 200 megawatts of transfer capability on that constraint because of the loop flow. That's what's going on here. So these loop flows reduce the transfer capability to balancing area C to meet its load in the north with cheap generation in the south. Go to the next slide. And that in the previous example, we said, okay, it's an intertie schedule, but in this, it could just be the same thing, that flow from A to B just could be the EDM dispatch. EDM could just be dispatching generation to meet load, and it happens to result in generation being dispatched down in B and up in A, and we'll get exactly the same impacts. Go to the next slide. And with WEAM pricing, Western EIM pricing, where we price the congestion impacts into the prices that all the generation resources pay, the price of balancing area A will be lower because of its impact on that constraint. Even though there's no constraint between A and B, the price in A will be lower. And James' example illustrated this perfectly, because you could remember that he had, even though there was no constraint down in the source in the south east corner, there was no constraint between it and the balancing area to the north. The price was lower because it reflected the impact on this other constraint. And if balancing area C kept the congestion revenues from that constraint, it would not be adversely impacted because the shadow price of that constraint is going to take into account the lowest cost, the generation that's on the margin in C and in the south and in the north. So it's going to reflect the difference in cost. So as long as all the generation that's dispatched down in C has costs higher than the $20, when they get the congestion rents, balancing area C's ratepayers will be no worse off than if there was no loop flow. So that there is a balance in this. However, as we started talking about, once you give some of that congestion rents to generators or schedulers in the other balancing area, then the impact of dispatching down the balancing area C generation in the south means those ratepayers are worse off, so that they lose as a result of the fact of the loop flows. Go to the next slide. On the other hand, to provide a full picture, there are also loop flows going around the other way. Now I've added the fact that because balancing area C is also interconnected with A and B, when you dispatch generation in southern part of C to meet generation in the north, some of those flows go around through the other balancing area A, balancing area A to B to C to D, and then down to the north. So not all the power has to flow over the constraint. So there are benefits to it. So this makes it a little bit complicated in talking about, who's worse off overall, because there clearly is an impact on the native load in balancing area C when they have to dispatch down their generation because of loop flow, their cheap generation in the south. But on the other hand, they benefit from the interconnection because actually they get to generate more cheap generation in the south than they otherwise could, because some of that power flows around through A and B and into D and then down. So it doesn't flow over the constraint. So the net benefits can be difficult to evaluate. Finally, one simplified example. Go to the next slide. And this is the same as the others, except I've moved the constraint between balancing areas C and D. And we still have loop flows. The schedule from A to B, whether it's an OAT transaction or EDAM dispatch, is going to cause power to flow through C and into D and then over to B. So that flow is going to reduce the transfer capability available between balancing areas C and D. So there'll be less import capability available to balancing area D. But conversely, as in the example before, we have the little green arrow going around the other way, that because not all the power has to flow over that constraint when cheap generation in balancing area C is dispatched up, some of it can flow around through the other areas and get to D. So it doesn't, you've got more transfer capability than you'd think just looking at the flows on that constraint. So this is setting up why this is a problem and why it's not completely simple to allocate the dollars. So I'll stop here and pause for questions, comments, etc. Discussion. Ben, I guess first Ben and Jim. No.
Yep.
Okay. Take operator. Could you check with people on the lines into the meeting?
Just as a reminder for attendees, if you have questions, you can press the raise hand icon at the bottom of your participants panel. At this time, I'm not seeing any hands up in the question queue.
Thank you. I'll go ahead then. Go to the next slide. And this is just, I'm not going to dwell on this, but just to highlight what we found in other balancing areas, that when you move from OAT service to a market, there are benefits to the OAT service. And when you're looking at whether OAT service transactions are better or worse off, we have to, keep in mind that when the transmission service gets paid, whether it is, if it's settled like a CRR, it gets paid all the time, not just when it's used, without regard to feasibility. Rights can be completely infeasible, but they get paid. When there's redispatch, transactions aren't subject to TLRs, so they, again, can flow when they're not really infeasible. And they get paid for counterflow, whereas OAT transactions don't get paid for counterflow, they just flow. So that's why in most markets there's a benefit. Some things maybe transactions give something up, but they also get a lot of benefits. Now I'm going to go to the next slide and talk about something that Jim and Ben and I started talking about during the earlier presentations, is that when you tie allocation of congestion rents to transmission use, you inherently create use it or lose it incentives and inefficient dispatch incentives, because it means that when your dispatch signal is 20 and the price in the other area is 40, but you're going to get $8 of congestion back, you're not going to want to get dispatched off if the price is 20. You'd be, even if your cost is 20. If your cost is 20, 25, it'd still be economic to flow if you're going to get some of that congestion rents back. And that's why the, TCCs, FTRs, CRRs were developed and defined the way they are, is to get rid of these use it or lose it incentives so that you get the congestion revenues regardless of what you do, and therefore you don't have this incentive, to use it or lose it. And we have to tread carefully and think about how big those use it or lose it incentives are going to be when we start moving congestion rents around based on schedules. And part of we have to think about the benefit case for the WEAM and for EDAM in terms of lowering the overall cost of meeting load across the footprint. Well, part of that can be vitiated if the material use it or lose it effects, such that higher cost generation is going to get scheduled instead of lower cost generation because of the way we assign congestion rents. Go to the next slide. So if we, on the other hand, paid for counterflow as part of the market dispatch, that's better than OAT. But if we don't do that, we undermine the efficient incentives, because the high cost generation needs to be paid the higher price. If it has to give back that higher price, well, it's no longer economic to dispatch that generation. So intrinsically, we have to pay for counterflow OAT transactions or other transactions, even though it might be better than OAT, because that's necessary to get efficient outcomes in the market. Now, one way to potentially get around use it or lose it incentives would be to define the allocation of congestion rents based on something other than how you're actually dispatched, like RSE schedules, which then are adjusted in EDAM based on offer prices. But that could create another set of schedules incentives to create RSE schedules that don't reflect the actual use. Go to the next slide. So this is kind of drumming that point again, but when we allocate congestion rents to the balancing area, and the balancing area owns the generation, it's going to affect its incentive to how it bids its generation, and then enabling entities that self-schedule in EDAM to get paid, to get the rebate for their EDAM schedule, and then be dispatched down in real time based on their actual costs. I mean, that's efficient in the overall market if those are costs, and their costs are higher in real time. They get dispatched down, and they get paid for the deviations. But if we're setting up schedules in order to get the congestion rents, we can get inefficient behavior. And right now, basically, in WEAM, we settle entities for deviations from their balance, from their schedules, their pre-market schedules. And those deviations are settled at WEAM prices, so it gives people efficient incentives based on those prices and the schedules that are fixed and don't depend on how they're actually dispatched in real time. Now, all of these incentive effects that I'm talking about, on the other hand, are not that important if the loop flow charges are small or if they're very unpredictable. So that you don't want to change your bids because you have no idea whether it's going to be material loop flow and whether you're going to get $8 back or 27 cents back. So we're talking about these conceptual challenges and steps, the bridges and water rivers we're crossing when we start rebating, but we also money to based on schedules. But it may be in particular cases, and for a while in the EDAM, this isn't going to be a big issue. let me pause there and, again, see if there are comments or questions or discussion.
I was going to do a little editorializing. I might as well do a little bit now because it's kind of along this theme. Yeah, I think what we're kind of searching for, at least in the two dimensions that I've been thinking about on this topic, have been kind of how either of the EDAM paradigms relates to kind of the status quo. And my sense is that the transitional paradigm is closer to the status quo in the sense that, you're not really paying much for the parallel flows currently. There might be some transfer restrictions, but it's not clear who even bears the consequences of that. And in that sense, if we think of the sort of equity considerations, that having more entities join EDAM, and even if it comes with this sort of status quo treatment of parallel flows, is still maybe a step in the right direction, even for the impacted party who's been suffering the parallel flows. And I should say, all the examples we've sort of have, I think, even literally or at least implicitly think of California as the one with the parallel flows, and that's maybe the immediate sort of paradigm. But I would imagine as EDAM footprint grows, that's not going to be the case, and so we probably shouldn't be thinking explicitly in those terms, or everybody needs to think about themselves both as sort of experiencing and imposing parallel flows on the others. So anyways, there's this transitional thing about, I think from an equity perspective, you're not necessarily giving away anything that you're not already giving away by doing the transitional mechanism from the congestion rent perspective. Then there's the incentive angle, which I think where Scott was going and where I've been kind of trying to think through as well, maybe as a longer term approach, is there some way to try to distribute the congestion revenues that is less tied to immediate scheduling and bidding decisions, but might still be related. But the weaker that link gets, or the more averaged out it gets, the less likely it is to kind of distort day to day and hour to hour bidding decisions. And that's where sort of the maybe a formula that's adjusted every year or something like that can maybe try to capture some of the concerns here that drove the transitional proposal, but try to at least dilute some of the incentive effects that we've expressed that we're worried about here. And I guess a third dimension is kind of that I've been trying to think through whether the original EDAM proposal that doesn't have the transitional aspects also has some incentive effects. And I think that's why I was trying to talk through the transfer sort of limitations, that basically you could sort of think of under the transitional mechanism, there is you don't pay for the parallel flows you impose on other folks. But under maybe the original, there's an incentive to try to keep as much congestion revenue within your BAA as possible. Whether that's good or bad sort of depends upon whether you have a picture of whether you have an interest in the entire market, or just maybe the congestion revenues, or just maybe generation plus congestion or something like that. Okay, so that was a word salad, but I think that the two highlights are, transitional. I think of the transitional mechanism as kind of a less dramatic departure from the status quo. Maybe people can dispute that, and that over the longer term, I think trying to kind of come up with whatever is motivating this transitional proposal, trying to average out those effects over longer terms to try to decouple those incentive effects.
Right. I mean, the incentive effects, the base schedules are fixed, but you can think of also that the IFM, the EDAM schedules will be fixed at going into real time, and people will vary their dispatch, in real time, because you know, they'll follow the correct prices. So with just the EDM will affect, these incentives will affect the EDM unit commitment, and you could say that maybe the base schedules today have the same distortion because people set their base schedules in order to, to keep loop flows, and to keep get congestion rents on neighboring systems, even when they don't want to be dispatched that way. One thing though that is different is EDM flows are going to be, taking account of the EDM dispatch. It's not just the balancing area generation to load like the base schedules in WEAM. So the loop flows could be potentially right now, when you're dispatched above your base schedules in WEAM, in the Western EIM, you see the marginal prices on the loop flows and all those constraints.
Mm-hmm.
And you see the right marginal incentives. Now, that won't be the case in EDAM, but on the other hand, you'd still have the right incentives when you get to real time to put in real offer prices and be dispatched efficiently, because you wouldn't have it wouldn't have any impact. So there are some parallels, Jim. You're right, I think, that we have to think through. Why don't we ask if anybody in the meeting, on the phone lines or whatever, has comments on this part of the discussion?
Yep. While they're queuing up, Scott,
Sorry, I didn't see your head.
No, that I haven't found the hand button, so that's not your fault.
I can't find it either.
So this isn't directly relevant to the transition proposal, well, and how it might be ruled on, but in the longer term, whatever anybody has any thoughts about whether the issue of incentives for how you maintain the timing of maintenance in your transmission system, that if you could pull in more congestion rents by squeezing your capacity, by timing your maintenance right, or rather wrongly, get congestion revenues from others. And in the longer term, incentives for expanding your system, since at the moment, expanding your system, if the benefits are to folks elsewhere in the West because of their parallel flows, there's not really a lot of incentive to deal with your stakeholders to get siting permission to pay for things. Okay, so there could be a short run market power issue to restrict capacity, operate your generation, maintain your lines, to try to get more congestion rents from others in the short run. And then the longer run, there aren't the incentives that there ideally should be for modifying your system to benefit everyone. I'm not sure whether there are any frameworks to deal with this other than shedding light on the issues and talking about this. Just wondering if anybody has any thoughts on that. Again, it's not relevant to this immediate proposal, except to the extent that the transition proposal might actually weaken incentives to restrict capacity to try to get more congestion rents. In the long run, is this something that market monitors would need to pay attention to, or is it something that actually would wind up being perhaps something that would be a federal responsibility to keep an eye on, to make sure that there's no dog in the manger sort of a thing, somebody restricting grid capacity or not making it available in order to increase their rents?
I think there's some EDM principles that say that you can't have, set constraints that aren't real constraints. So that's not allowed. Now, your point about, how do you time your transmission outages to reduce transfer capability and create constraints that would make you money, but they'd also, raise the cost of meeting your your native load as well. And the loop flows are probably small compared to the cost of meeting your native load. So, you know, we'd have to think more about which way that's going to drive. But I'm thinking if the loop flows are 5% and 95% is meeting your native load, it probably most of the cost would still fall on you.
Right.
Yeah,
Which
if you're
is
integrated.
why I asked before the question about, you know, do we see circumstances where instead of 5%, 95%, it's, you know, it's a more even split. Jim?
Yeah, I guess on the short run, I mean, that again is one of the justifications or arguments for selling off the congestion rents or the transmission rights, that the, you know, physical controller of the grid doesn't necessarily have the residual claim to the congestion benefits. And there's sort of links about, you know, whether how their incentives are interacting with CRRs now. But I think the more germane point is Scott's, that I just think, and I think this is even more clear when you think about the long run incentives, that the congestion revenues are kind of swamped by other considerations. Even if you're a transmission only company, you've got a rate of return on expanding, you know, transmission that's probably looks a lot better than the benefits you might get from congestion. You know, maybe you could find certain areas where that balance is different. But if you're a regulated company, a regulated integrated company, particularly, you know, the incentives are going to be heavily influenced by that interaction with the regulators more than sort of trying to maximize your congestion rents. And you know, that was why we spend so much time talking about the idea of merchant transmission, is like the idea that if whatever it is about the process is preventing this kind of expansion that looks like it would really connect two very you know, price differential nodes, then there should be a way to have some kind of free entry to transmission if it's not imposing negative impacts on others. But you know, I think the fact that we've had so little of it sort of again illustrates that nodal price differences just aren't a huge driver in transmission planning or expansion, I think, in either direction, probably in reality.
Okay.
So I'd just like to refer to some experience in Europe that I think is relevant to this, that in the end, it was the European regulator that called out Sweden's behavior, where Sweden basically squeezed transmission capability within its balancing authority, not the between country capacity, but just short of the border, squeezes capacity so as to lower spot prices within Sweden for its own consumers, but to have all the congestion rents, implicit congestion rents, stay within Sweden rather than have them occur for lines to other countries, which would then be split with other countries. And they got called out for that, and they insist they weren't really doing that. But at any rate, it was a case, and there were penalties applied. So it does show that it is possible for a regulatory authority above states to watch out and even try to enforce, try to prevent that sort of behavior. But the fact that I can only think of one case kind of indicates how difficult that would actually be, given that I'm more also familiar with circumstances in other countries in continental Europe where the same sort of behavior, in terms of pushing congestion to internal constraints rather than constraints shared with neighboring countries, seems to have been indulged in order to capture more rents locally. You don't see a lot of you don't see a lot of cases enforced on that. So it may happen, but there doesn't seem to be a strong incentive not to do that. And perhaps there are lessons there that might be applicable here in the long run, especially when we go beyond the transition proposal, which weakens that incentive, to the WEEMS
and then the EDAM system as originally proposed, where the rents would accrue to where the congestion takes place. Okay, thanks. I think Scott, if you think we're ready, we can go to the phone lines.
Yep. Anybody, operator, is there any comments or questions on the phone?
We have just a couple hands up so far. First, Alan Meck has his hand up.
Go ahead, Alan.
Hi, Alan Meck, PG&E. Going back to the conversation that Jim brought up, any sense or any data that any of you can think of that would point to how much dollars we're talking about transferring between BAAs at net? Because that really, it seems to me to be like the critical analysis that we need in order to understand like the boundaries of this problem and what the solutions might be. If we're giving up a couple $1 million, okay. If we're net neutral, great. If we're getting a couple $1 million, or if we're losing a couple $1 million, all right, well, but I just don't want to lose our shirts here. Are we talking about hundreds of millions of dollars? Because that's where this gets potentially scary. It's probably not, but I don't know.
Right, I agree that's an important question. I don't think we have the data on that. We might be able to do some calculations based on, but it'd be fairly complicated to take historical market flow impacts and calculate the flows and the constraints and the shadow prices and figure this out, but maybe it could be done for a few illustrative hours.
Yeah, and I can elaborate more on that, Scott. This is Guillermo from the CAISO. You are pointing to the right complications to try to come with something that is reasonable and could make sense. And one of the complications is that we don't have such market running up right now, right? We may have information about the transactions that may happen, what the prices, the level of congestion, the shadow prices that could play a role, either between CAISO constraints or PAC Portland constraints. It would require to start building assumptions on top of assumptions. So we don't have any production data as of now that could give us a good reference of the magnitude of this cost. We can point to some level of the information that we have in the real-time market, but still we know that the day-ahead market is going to have different controls, more flexibility to do congestion management. So even just extrapolating real-time could be problematic. In short, we don't have a meaningful, reasonable data to make such estimates.
Understood.
Thanks, Guillermo. Operator, you said there were several questions?
We have just one more in the queue. Steve Keen, your line is unmuted. You can go ahead.
Hi, this is Steve Keen from Edison. I have a question concerning the example that James showed. He assumed that the marginal energy cost was the same across the footprint. But when I look at the examples he's coming up with, he's showing different LMPs in the different BAAs. And it's kind of a two-part question. One, I don't really understand how that happens.
Well, think about the $20 price that he uses. That's sort of the reference bus price, and the MCCs are congestion components. So that's the same as it is in the CAISO. You've got a reference bus price that's the same across the footprint, and then you have marginal congestion components at each location. So you can think of the reference bus price in that example as, $20, and then you had lower prices down in can't remember which region it was. At the bottom, you had lower ones because the marginal congestion component was negative. So you had prices of, $10 and $14 in the south, and then you had prices of $41 and $40 above it. So you had a reference bus price of 20, and then the actual LMPs in the areas, depending on the congestion component.
Okay, I guess I have to think about that some more, because it seems to me that the assumption that there were basically there's no binding constraints across the interties if there's
Yeah,
a,
but
if there's a price of, $10 in one and across the intertie in the other, it's $14.
right, but that's because of the shift factor impact on that binding constraint. That's the way it actually works in the Western EIM today. That in that, the generation that was down in, I got his example now so I can get it right. Balancing area A, the southern part of balancing area A, the price was $10. There was a negative $10 congestion component because that had a large impact on that constraint. And over in balancing area B, the congestion component was -6, so the price was 14. It was higher because it has smaller impact on that constraint. But the WEAM dispatch, when it does the optimization, it says if I dispatch generation up in B to meet load in C, it's actually going to exacerbate that constraint in A and make me back down $10 generation and replace it with $41 generation, so that I've got to factor that cost into my dispatch and generation in balancing area B. And that happens, every 5 minutes in the Western EIM today. It takes account of those loop flow effects at the margin. They're all settled relative to your base schedules, but when you're dispatched above your base schedule, you're going to be exposed to those loop flow prices if they exist.
Okay. I understand the concept. I'm having some issues with that. But the other question I wanted to ask then coming off of that is, since we oftentimes have different, we have the transfer congestion, how, what happens when there is transfer congestion as well? How does this interact with that? And, before we decide which way is the best way to do it, shouldn't we at least consider what would happen if there's a transfer congestion as well interacting with it?
Well, yeah, all the constraints are going to interact in the sense that if one constraint binds, another constraint might. So, or might not. And you're right. There is also constraints between the balancing areas, and as I think we talked about earlier in the CAISO presentation, those revenues will be shared 50-50.
Correct. Yeah, if a transfer constraint is binding, you will get a separation between the marginal energy costs of the BAAs, and then based upon the transfer between the BAAs, we'll calculate transfer revenue, we'll split that 50-50 between the BAAs.
But wouldn't that transfer revenue also be affected potentially by the loop flow?
No. So the scheduled loop flow, which would be the transfer, if the transfers are getting up to the transfer limit, and it's a net transfer, then you're going to have to now dispatch generation in the balancing authority area that is net binding from a transfer's perspective, which is why their marginal energy cost is going up and is not impacted by the constraint anymore, because you're not flowing energies, therefore, through the constraint. And that's why we've done the separation between the marginal energy costs associated with the power balance constraint violation versus the internal constraint that's binding and has loop flow impacts.
Right, but let's distinguish between the load balance constraint, transfer constraint, and I think we're talking about just the transfer constraints between balancing areas. So that's not a load balance constraint. That's just another transmission limit, but it's one that's between balancing areas, and it'll cause, when that constraint binds, it'll cause generation to be dispatched differently all across the footprint, just like a loop flow constraint, and it'll potentially change which constraints bind and what their shadow prices are, just like the loop flow constraint will change the shadow price of, the internal constraints will change the shadow price of the constraints between regions. So, I mean, yeah, all those things change, but I mean, that's the way it works today. And it always works that way, that you've got, they're all just, different transmission constraints, and the money from the ones between balancing areas is being allocated differently than the ones within. Now, that does create the issues that Ben was talking about if we don't monitor. But as we talked about earlier, the EDAM philosophy is those internal constraints have to be based on, the real grid characteristics and can't be made up, but that'll have to be monitored.
All right.
Agreed,
Thanks.
Scott, yeah, we'll have to look at it.
Operator, are there more questions outstanding?
Yes, we had a couple more hands go up actually. Mark Price, your line is unmuted. You can go ahead.
Hey, this is Mark Price from DC Energy. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
We think this has been a really good conversation here, and some of the concerns that Scott Harvey has brought up in terms of incentives and that being able to, overcome or creating a potential barrier to realizing the full benefit of EDAM is a good point and something that has resonated with us. But actually, my question was going to go back to a question that Doug from Bay Area Municipal brought up. And since I saw Guillermo jump in, I thought maybe it'd be a good time to ask this now. But Doug asked, and I don't mean to put anyone on the spot here, and we can perhaps discuss this in a different forum, but Doug asked about the modeling of loop flows in the CRR allocation and auction models. And on today's call, it was described that those are being modeled in the CRR allocation and auction. But on the conversation that we had at the March 12th CRR Enhancements Working Group, a similar question was asked, and it was described that those are not being modeled. So I don't mean to put anyone on the spot, but we're just trying to get clarity of understanding of what is actually being modeled in the allocation and auction. I'm wondering if it's perhaps, we know there's a global D-rate factor that's applied, and maybe that's what we mean when we say we're modeling loop flows, that we're using the global D-rate factor to account for that. But just wanted to see if, Kaisa could provide some clarity about exactly how that is done. And perhaps maybe that's a discussion for the CRR Enhancements Working Group that we can go into more detail.
Yeah, thank you.
Scotty, if you don't mind, I can answer that, and I think it's a good time to clarify. And thank you, Mark, for pointing to the subtle nuance here. Let me elaborate in a more complete answer. We do model the expanded footprint of the WEC as part of the full network model that is used for the CRR allocation and auction process. It's not anymore the boundary limit definition of the CAISO footprint only. That means that when we release the model and we run the power flow for the CRR, there will be flows going beyond the CAISO footprint. That is one consideration, that we do account for the extended detailed full network model. Now, that doesn't mean that we are explicitly modeling the effect or the contributions of the parallel flows in the release of the CRR in either the allocation or the auction. We are just simply modeling the loop effects that may happen in the transmission configuration. Now, unlike the energy market where you have the consideration of the scales that are beyond the CAISO market, there is no such thing in the CRR model, right? It's just a transmission model where we model sources and sinks for the CRRs. There are no considerations of additional injections for sources and sinks beyond the CRR that are being defined in the CAISO footprint. Now, there is a secondary way we account to some extent for the parallel flows in the release of the CRR. Back in the early days when we implemented the full network model, we came to this dilemma, how we do it now that we're going to have the full network model used in the CRR release process. The complication was that we have no ability at that time, and maybe even as of now, to target constraint by constraint and account for what transmission capacity is being used and taken away by the parallel flows. So A blunt approach has been to effectively rely on the global derating factor to bring down across the transmission system the capacity on every single transmission constraint that, if it is meaningful enough, could do some rough justice to take away capacity that otherwise would be used by parallel flows. It's not precise science, it's an approximation. And indeed, in some cases, you may have parallel flows that are actually providing counter flows. That is not going to be accounted for in this approach of the global derating factor. Let me know if that clarifies.
I think that helps me. Just let me repeat back what I heard, that when you do the CR allocation and auctions, you use the full network model, which has other BAs, not just the CAISO in it, but you're not trying to get the the injections and withdrawals across all of that model to be perfectly accurate when you do your allocations and the auctions, and you use the global derate factor as sort of a approximate blunt instrument to try to get it at least approximately correct. Did I summarize it maybe decently well?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. That helps a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Our other hand up in the queue put their hand down. I believe their question may have been answered. So with that, we have no further questions in the queue.
Okay, why don't we go ahead to the next slide? And this is just to have a little perspective relative to other ISOs. When you think about the MISO formation, there was a lot of existing rights and that had to be blended and entitlements to meet native load. And MISO happened all at once. There was a big bang where it started on April 1, 2005. So we resolved all that in a process that took years to work out agreement on what those entitlements were. And SPP had a big bang when they went to the day-ahead market and CRRs in 2014. And like you go back to NYSO, where I was involved back in the 90s, again, there was a extended a period of reaching agreement on grandfathered rights and converting them to TCCs and all that stuff, and it all happened at once. One thing that we have to keep in mind about the Western EIM and EDIM is the Western EIM grew gradually, and it didn't start with everybody in it, and EDIM's not starting with everybody in it, but we expect it to grow. So we have to have a perspective in arriving at a long-term design that maybe we have to wait to leave a critical mass of participants in it or in the process of joining before we agree at the final design. One element that might be a transitional element that would limit the impact of loop flows under the CAISO proposal would be to have some kind of limit on flow entitlements, or a limit on the amount of neighboring balancing area flows on individual balancing area constraints. Going back to what Alan was saying about, is this a $5 million problem or a $100 million problem? One way to bound that would be to say, well, there's only going to be so much loop flow entitlement on other systems. And that's not new. Go to the next slide. This kind of system was implemented 20 years ago between MISO and PJM. It's part of the Joint Congestion Management design that in the East replaced TLRs and with congestion charges as a way for managing loop flows. And just as is the case today in the Western EIM, everything above your base schedule you pay congestion charges for, and we're going to charge congestion in EDIM. Now PJM and MISO have this in effect, and I've got the site there to the most recent state of the market report, and the net payments from PJM to MISO were over $40 million in 2024 for these flow impacts on the other constraints. So it's not something that's never been done, and it's not necessarily small dollars. Another thing that I point out here is that PJM and MISO agreed on years ago on firm flow entitlements on the other system. So there's only so much loop flow. You're entitled to some loop flow on the other system. That goes back to my example about, well, you inherently have some, and remember, when I have loop flow on you, you probably have loop flow on me. And so there's some offsetting, but we don't want it to be too far in one direction. So they worked out a system of flow entitlements on what's called the market-to-market constraints, which are the constraints that are significantly impacted by each other's dispatch. And they don't pay any congestion as long as they don't use more than their entitlement. But once they go over their entitlement, they have to pay the congestion charges, and that's the $40 million. But they only pay it when the constraint's binding. They don't pay it just for flows over the other system. And this has been in effect for 20 years. So it's something to have in our minds as we think about what we want to do. And going back to what Alan is talking about, if you have a firm flow entitlement limit, that you can only have so much loop flows before you start having to pay for it at the margin, that caps the downside for the balancing areas that might be impacted by loop flows, but still provides a reasonable range for balancing areas to create some degree of loop flows on their neighbors without having to pay congestion charges. Let me pause here and see if there are questions about this history and concept. No? Okay, let's go ahead. Next slide. And one thing that we've got to think about, and it's sort of solved by having firm flow entitlements, is if balancing areas can continue going on selling additional OAT service, we don't want that to create an unbounded increase in loop flows on adjacent systems. But we have a firm flow entitlement that limits the amount of payments that can be made, and balancing areas will take that into account when they sell more OAT service. That, well, I'm not going to get paid for loop flows in other systems beyond this, because I'll have reached the loop flow entitlement in many hours of the year, or not. That's something to take account of. Go to the next slide.
Scott, can I interrupt with a quick
Sure.
question?
Yeah.
So on slide 16, I think it is. There's probably not an answer available, but if there were no entitlements, or if the entitlements were zero, that 41 million net, do you think it would have been a lot bigger, many multiples of that, or any idea of the relative magnitude that of money transfers that are avoided because of the entitlements?
No, I think it's knowable. I mean, somewhere in the settlement system, you can know what the actual flows were on the constraint.
Yeah.
They subtracted out the entitlement to get the payment. So if you knew the entitlement, you could increase the payments by the shadow price times the entitlement. But I don't know. And, they're about, I don't know, I think it's 248 market-to-market constraints. So it isn't just taking one number, but it might be a few that account for most of it. But yeah, it's knowable, but I'm not aware of it where it could be posted, but it might be. I mean, somebody could take an action item to track that down, but I can't tell them where it would be.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, back to where we were. I guess we were on slide 18. And to go back to incentives, I think in doing this, we have to, in any design we come up, we should keep in mind some aspects of CRRs that they have these features for a reason, and that they're subject to a simultaneous feasibility test. We can't just keep selling OAT service without limit and creating infeasible flows. That we need to have a cap on that. And right today, there's no simultaneous feasibility test on the OAT transfers and the native load entitlements that are out there. And CRRs in some systems may not be fully funded, depend on how much congestion rents are calculated and outages. They're obligations, so they require payments when they become counterflow. And the last bullet, most importantly, they are by intent. When Hogan developed these many years ago, it was a fundamental aspect of it was that they would be disconnected from generation schedules or dispatch in order to avoid use it or lose it incentives. And if you actually want to go back to the origin of FTRs and PJM, it wasn't financial transmission rights, it was fixed transmission rights. Because when we were discussing the PJM supporting companies to design, there was some thought initially, well, why don't we just give it away for use of the transmission system? And that was the original design. We pointed out that won't work because of all these incentives. And that's why the design that was actually implemented was called the fixed transmission right design, because they recognized that we had to fix the entitlement in order to create the right incentives. So this is an important element of CRRs, and we don't necessarily have it to do it the same way in EDAM, but we have to have this idea in mind of limiting the adverse effects on the dispatch of the way we allocate the congestion rents so that we don't undo the benefits. Go to 19. So this is just about shifting gears to talk about long-term evolution. And the bottom line here is just that like a long-term goal should be development of some type of financial right that separates the incentives so that people have the incentive to follow the dispatch and we don't have use it or lose it incentives. But the rest of the slide is pointing out that this is not an easy lift, that we have to recognize that there's a lot of complications in doing that. So we're not going to have, it's not workable to say we're going to hold off EDAM until we solve that problem. That's something that'll have to be worked out over time. Go to the next slide. You know, a reasonable aspect of what the CAISO's done in terms of assigning internal congestion rents to the balancing areas is it does internalize with them the award, the sale of infeasible OAT service, because they have to bear the cost. If they've got 5,000 megawatts of rights across a 2,000 megawatts constraint, they can't socialize that to the rest of EDAM. It's their problem. And if they take transmission outages that reduce the transfer capability from 3,000 megawatts to 1,000 megawatts, it's their problem. And they've got to resolve that with their, transmission customers under or their OAT. They can't spread that problem to the rest of the EDAM, and that's a good concept. On the other hand, there are loop flows, and it is inevitable, as we started out, loop flows are inherent, and some degree of loop flows are reasonable. And that puts us towards maybe having some sort of flow entitlement cap. So there's some degree of rebate of loop flow costs, but it isn't unlimited. So that there's a cap of flow entitlement, so you can't get more than that amount of free loop flow. One thing that we should also have in mind in terms of evolution is if you start doing these kind of caps and some of these ad hoc designs, they're pretty simple to administer between, Pacific Corp and CAISO. But if we start to get more and more balancing areas as the EDAM, as we know is going to happen, that's going to get more complicated. So we're going to have to start thinking about the evolution at some point as something more durable. So that wraps it up, and we can take any final comments. And we got a bit left before 3:30, so we're set.
Thank you, Scott. Silas, is there, well, first, Jim, do you have any questions or comments?
I already kind of slipped my editorials in, so not at this time.
Thanks for doing so. Silas, is there anybody queued up who would like to ask a question, make a comment?
Have any queued up so far? Just as a quick reminder, that raise hand button is inside the participants panel. You'll just need to click that participants panel to open it up and then find the raise hand icon at the bottom. Nope, we have no hands up in the queue at this time.
Okay, someone from the CAISO should step in and decide what we want to do in terms of timing. Do we want to start up with CRRs now, or pause for lunch, or what?
Seeing no hands, let's take a pause for lunch. We'll come back at the scheduled time to talk about CRRs. We're ending about 20 minutes early.
Okay. Thanks,
Okay.
Amelia.
Long lunch.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So see you all at 1:30 Pacific time. Thanks very much. Great discussion. Thanks, everybody, for Milos, Scott, and Jim for the presentation and discussions. And we'll see you later.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had a good lunch break. This is Ben Hobbs, chair of the MSC, back with Jim and Scott and ISO staff.
And I'm pleased to say that Partha will be kicking things off with a staff presentation about congestion revenue rights. And then we will follow with a pair of MSC presentations by Scott Harvey and Jim Bushnell. And after that discussion, so this is an issue that we've been talking about since long before MRTU in various ways, and surely we'll be talking about it in the future. So unlike this morning's discussion where action is expected by the ISO board fairly quickly on a very topical issue, this is more one where the data and arguments have been developing and on the back burner of a stove, and the flavors have been gotten well mixed, and we're not going to have conclusions likely today, and so the discussion is basically going to be pushing the issue along, but we probably won't wind up extending the discussion past the planned 3 o'clock time, but rather building the basis for further discussions at later stakeholder and MSC meetings. Any rate, so Partha, it's all yours.
No, thank you, Ben, and thank you. I really appreciate your analogies. I think that those are you're spot on in terms of where we're at in the process. So, yeah, if you want to flip to the next slide. So really appreciate the opportunity to discuss our congestion revenue rights reform initiatives with you all today. For the sake of stakeholders listening in who might not be following the CRR initiative as closely, I thought I'd give some brief background on where we're on the process, as well as where we're going next, before we get diving into some of the MSC's presentations. So just for the way of background and to add to what Dr. Hobbs you'd indicated, we kicked off this working group for a couple of different reasons. First, I say is to meet our commitments coming out of the 2016 to 2019 CR reforms processes, where we committed to relook at the effectiveness of those changes. And the second purpose is really to respond to various stakeholder requests that we received in the catalog process related to CRRs. So we've had 4 meetings to date. 2 were really focused on level setting on the current CAISO CRR processes and procedures. And then we had 2 subsequent meetings that Guillermo and his team led, where we really wanted to sort of dive into some of our root cause analysis, particularly related to some of the challenges identified from a revenue inadequacy perspective. Ultimately, we're going to try to build that analysis towards the development of goals, problem statements, and ultimately policy solutions. If you want to go to the next slide, appreciate that. So the 3 main problem statements areas that stakeholders identified to date, and at least I'd indicate as well that these are really preliminary. These are based upon stakeholder feedback. Some of them are based on the lessons learned coming out of the previous initiative process. But we're still very much in the development phase. But the ones that to date that we've heard sort of the most feedback from participants on really, first are around, revenue adequacy, which I know that you all had listened and engaged to Guillermo and his team's discussion of some of the root causes around that. But the second topics are really around what's been branded as auction efficiency, which is really currently, as defined, the fact that on aggregate, the payouts for auction CRRs exceed the payments made for CRRs in the auction by a certain percentage. But I'd also note that there's significant disagreement that there's really the right way to look at auction efficiency, or there's other ways that we should be considering this issue. And then I think from a third standpoint, and this probably has the least contention to it, there's been various requests to relook at, product definitions, the products that are being sold to better align with participant hedging needs. So as a stakeholder group, we're really about to move towards the problem statement discussion, and then early this summer, work on sort of the policy development and solutions. But we really appreciate the chance to hear from you all early in this process as it could help shape the discussion, those subsequent discussions, as well as any additional analysis that we might need to perform as we move forward in the process. So, and finally, at least I'd like to touch on, I know that next week we'll be hosting a working group meeting where we're going to have speakers from the Midwest ISO, PJM, and ERCOT discussing their various financial transmission right processes as well. So, but yeah, I'll stop there and we can sort of get to the heart of the discussion with your all's presentations. But yeah, really appreciate the chance to provide that background. Yeah, with that, Ben, I'll turn it back to you. If you have any questions, I know as well we have Hillary Stavers here, as well as Guillermo. Happy to provide any background on where we're at and the pathway forward.
Okay, thank you, Partha and Hillary. Jim and Scott, you want to make any quick questions or wait until your presentations?
Yeah, I think we should just go ahead.
Yeah,
okay, Scott, okay. And now let me just check, see if there's anybody queued up on the phone lines.
As a post-lunch reminder, if you want to ask a question, you can press the raise hand icon located at the bottom of your participants panel. We do not have any hands up in the queue at this time.
Okay, thanks. Scott?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. Would you go to the next slide, please? So these are the topics I'm going to talk about, mostly starting out with Guillermo's root cause analysis. And I haven't absorbed all of it, but I've been looking carefully at it. And again, gave me a lot of things to talk about. So that's going to be the first topic. Let's go to slide 3. I think, looking at FTRs and TCCs and other markets, one of the things that really struck me was the finding that we have constraints with negative price flows in the IFM. And that's very unusual from what happens in other markets. That was analyzed, and there's reductions in the shift factor truncation that's used in calculating flows, and those went into effect. But we're still observing negative flows on constraints, which means that the ISO and the IFM is buying counterflow because the other flows that are in the power flow solution are in excess of the limit. And that's very odd. I'm very grateful to the CAISO for Guillermo in particular and his team for analyzing this, because I think it's important to get to the bottom of this. And as Guillermo talked about in his presentation, the CAISO has analyzed this and looked at specific constraints. And it's clear that part of the issue is still shift factor truncation, that even with the changes that were made, we still have flows that are dropped, to zero because of, or below because of the shift factor truncation. So it appears we have no price flows on the constraint, when in fact there are lots of flows due to the generation and load. They're just below the shift factor truncation. And, but that's not the only issue. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Go to the next slide. Guillermo identified a few specific constraints where we have large unpriced flows. Some of these are low voltage constraints, and I can, that might be one pattern, that very low voltage constraints, everything has a low shift factor. So maybe we need to do something about the shift factor for low voltage constraints. But Guillermo's analysis is broad enough that we also see examples of constraints that are not at all low voltage lines, but we still have negative, large unpriced flows. Not negative, but large unpriced flows. So there's something going on. And I think it's good for us to try to get to the bottom of this and understand what is the cause of the the unpriced flows and reduce the level. And this is not reducing the level of the unpriced flows by making changes in shift factor truncation, for example, is not just a matter of congestion rent shortfalls. This also affects load pricing and it affects generators. Generators can be paying much more than the value of their generation if the shift factor truncation is eliminating the impact of their output on seriously binding constraints. So it's important to get to the bottom of this, and not just now that we know that at least some of the problem is due to shift factor truncation, we got to think about, okay, we already made changes in shift factor truncation. What do we do next, given that it seems to be still a material impact on some of these constraints? Is it just, do we just look at the low voltage constraints and maybe use a different truncation for them? Or is there something more fundamental? And looking at what is the problem? Is the problem that the 0.2 shift factor per lapse, that the truncation, is that too high for per lapse because they're just so big? Or is it something to do with, the 2% cutoff for other resources, and try to figure out what it is, what we can do better without dropping, without eliminating all shift factor truncation. What can we do to make this look better, I think is an important goal. Go on to the next slide. The other thing coming out of Guillermo's analysis, though, is that the negative flows are not all about shift factor truncation. And I think that's important, and I think we need to run down. He's identified specific instances. Some are among the cases where we have the negative flows. Others are just where we have large gaps between the market flows and the limit. And I think we need to dig into this and understand the reasons. It's probably because of loop flows or TOR flows or ETC flows, but we need to be sure that at least that's the universe of what we're dealing with. We want to rule out the possibility that there's some other bug or flaw or something that's causing the problem that we haven't thought of. So running a couple of these examples that he's identified to ground and say, what is at the bottom here? What's going on would be good, at least to verify that for the ones we've identified, we know what the problem is. There's not something we've failed to recognize that's going on somewhere in the software that we haven't thought of. The other thing is that if we do determine that it's something involved in the modeling of loop flows, TOR flows, or ETC flows, which is it and what do we do? We talked, and this ties back to the discussion this morning about obviously loop flows on the CAISO grid. And those loop flows that we were talking about can result in derates in the IFM where not all the capacity is available to meet CAISO load. And if we sold CRRs that are basically most of the capacity, then we end up with shortfalls. But it's kind of remarkable if you think about loop flows, that why would loop flows be so large that they're more than all the transfer capability of the constraint? And if we've got CRR, a global derate of 20%, why are they so much more than that we've got a problem? So I think it's worth digging into this, exactly what's going on with loop flows and the way they're modeled. I mean, you remember that, Milos and George and Guillermo talked about the way, we model these loop flows in the IFM, but that might not be perfect. And there might be a systematic bug. We haven't really looked at this in, 15 years, and maybe there's something there that's not quite right that we ought to dig into, because these are anomalous results, and we're not looking under all the haystacks in California. We got a couple haystacks that Guillermo's analysis has identified, and we can look at those and see what's going on with them, because it's kind of hard to believe that this is all just loop flows. It seems to me there's something more going on. And maybe again, like the TOR and ETC models were developed years ago, are they still right for the way that those rights are being used today? So I think for all of these reasons, we want to run down exactly what's going on, not in every example, but a couple of the examples that Guillermo identified where you really see a problem and figure out what's going on. So let me stop there and pause for discussion from Ben and Jim and then others in the room.
Well, I think that one thing that would be useful probably in next week's session, my sense is that the revenue inadequacy is worse in California. and it's more mysterious as well. And so also kind of just working through the list of suspects and thinking about which ones really aren't a big deal in Eastern markets. Like I don't have a good sense about whether ETCs and equivalents are nearly as prominent in those markets. My sense is that loop flows are also not as prominent, but maybe they're just between ISOs rather than sort of non-ISO to ISO. But is that your sense?
I mean, I know I worked with MISO a bit on their loop flows, and they try hard to model them. And they model them in the IFM and they model them in the CRR market. But of course, it's hard.
Yeah.
As we talked this morning, the granularity of the CRR market is different from the granularity of the IFM. And if you've got patterns that only crop up sporadically, you can have big shortfalls at times, but it's a perfectly adequate model most of the time, but not all of the time. And that's a tough model, a tough problem to fix. But we ought to see that's just the magnitude of these where the constraint where it actually we got negative flows. It's weird that the loop flow would be that large. And maybe we're modeling something wrong. Maybe there's something where, something going on somewhere that's not quite right. But yeah, it is going to be intrinsically difficult for the CAISO just because, loop flows in the IFM are modeled hour by hour, day by day. And that's not the way the CRR auctions are run.
Mm-hmm. And on the shift factors, just remind me again. So this is a computational reason, right? That's why we do the truncation is for solution time. Is that why we do it? Or is it lead to spurious, sort of anomalous, like volatile LMPs if we just crank down the impact, the truncation of the shift factors? Like why is it 2%? Why isn't it 0.2 everywhere? Or and have computers gotten faster so we can deal with it better now?
I think in general the story I've heard is it's computational issues, but other ISOs have been reducing the threshold and use lower ones. But I don't know, someone for the CAISO, if George is on or somebody can speak to, exactly what. But the CAISO did lower the shift factor a lot for the laps.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that's different about California is nobody has a load zone that's remotely the size of PG&E or Edison. So that's another thing of if we cleared them based on sublaps or something, maybe some of it would be gone. But they've reduced the shift factor to 0.2% for the laps. So that's a long ways, but that's why it'd be good to know, is that the problem still, or is it something else? And it seems to me we can look and see, now that they've done the calculations on these constraints and know what was truncated, they can see, well, what was the difference between where did the change in flows come from? And then we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. Maybe it'd be a really hard answer, but at least we'd have some basis.
Yeah,
if I could just follow up on that, Jim. Scott is right. There are basically two drivers for which we have used this threshold for the shift factors in the market. One, as indicated, is the computational effort, right? The lower the shift factor you may have, the more computation you need to be able to handle more, a larger set of the shift factors and the constraints that they are related to. And the other one was more of a practical intuition from the time we went live with the nodal market in terms of what does it mean to have a very small shift factor for congestion management. In practical terms, it effectively means that you may be moving largely one specific resource for the sake of getting very little congestion relief. And it's measured by the shift factor, right? If you have to move a resource 100 megawatts to relieve basically 0.1 megawatt on a constraint, that is not really a good way to handle the congestion. And in practical terms, we wouldn't operate the system that way. So it has this practical association of what is practically a meaningful shift factor to use. And we did some studies before going live with MRTU to come with this
Just a
value?
second, Guillermo, I want to stop you there because remember, the 2% shift factor is relative to the distributed load bus. You might well be moving that unit because its shift factor relative to the actual units you're using might be 1. So, there's a sense in which this fixation on, the magnitude of the shift factor relative to the distributed load bus is not really relevant because it's when you're moving a generation, it's the difference in the shift factors between what's being moved up and down, and that has nothing to do with the distributed load reference bus shift factor.
Yeah, I understand that, Scott, and we have actually explored potentially the more precise way to do this that is really the relative difference between locations, right? And that happens to be even more complicated to implement dynamically in the market.
And there probably was a report that I missed when this change happened, but I assume people looked at kind of what happened with both runtime performance and perhaps whether there was any dramatic changes in prices when the drop to 0.2 happened. I mean, if there was some major disruption, we would have heard about it, but I don't recall like discussing sort of the results of that particular change. So I don't know if anything dramatic popped out from prices or anything when that drop happened in the truncation.
Yeah. Now you're really challenging my memory, Jim. This is way back before implementation of the MRTU. We would have to see if there is.
Oh no, I'm thinking about the change that when you went from 2% to 0.2% at the lapse.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let me clarify. Yeah, we have a small enhancement that we implemented as part of this analysis of the CRR performance. I believe eventually we implemented that enhancement somewhere in 2024. And the analysis that we performed to arrive to that surgical enhancement was to target only the shift factors for aggregated locations, specifically the D-labs and the trading hubs, because the analysis that we did was that even though they may have a small shift factors, once you associate that with the volume of the transactions that they happen, you may be talking about D-labs, SCE, or PG&E that is a half of the load, right? 20,000 megawatts. So even a small contribution of these 20,000 megawatts could become significant for relatively small constraints. That is the reason we target those. And we did some analysis to see how it would impact, and that is the reason we proceed with that. There was discussion in the stakeholder process about potentially extending this to other locations, like other ones that could be relatively large, like intertie locations or large generating locations. We didn't move forward that far. We took the approach of wait and see if there was any opportunity to further tune the subset of locations that we could target for smaller shift factors. That is still a possibility. In the tariff filing that we did, we have to be very specific on the target to be only the aggregated locations.
Yeah, Grandma, my recollection is that you filed to have the authority to change it at the interties and FERC didn't give it to you. So maybe now your analysis, if we dig in and we see part of this problem is that intertie locations are getting truncated and there's a lot of volume, we could go back to FERC and say, well, we got the numbers now.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, Scott. Thank you.
Should we go to the phone lines and see if there's any further discussion there? Operator, could you check? I can't see hands raised where I am.
At this time, we don't have any hands up in the queue.
Okay. Go to the next slide, which is kind of on the same topic, but shifts a little bit. Digging down into these unidentified flows and what's causing it would also help us in other respects, because maybe we gain insights into the need to change the time granularity of CRRs to deal with some of this, and it would enable us to model some of these things better. And loop flows might be in one direction, the IFM, in part of the day and another and another part of the day. And maybe if we change the definition of CRRs, we might be able to model if loop flows are particularly problematic during a certain period of day, we could, change, if we change the granularity of CRRs, maybe we'd be able to do this better. And also, when we look at the ETC and in TORs, again, maybe we'd see reasons to change the way that's done in terms of, what's accurate today and modeling them as modeling ETCs as obligations and how the resource mix has changed things. So I think there's a lot of potential if we, and not digging into everything. And my view is that Guillermo's done a great job here of, we're not looking at all the haystacks in California. We got a few we can look at and see if we can figure out what's going on. And then maybe we can look further, or maybe we can, we'll figure out what the suspects are. So that's my further thought on Guillermo's analysis and where it takes us.
And thank you, Scott, for raising these points. Are very useful for us to have a reference of what's next in the analysis, and I appreciate the other nuances that you are pointing so that we can really tune and go deeper into the area of the investigations we have done. And yes, I think we have a few items already taken note for further and deeper analysis.
Great, Guillermo. I'm glad you did this because it really starts to answer questions we've had, and the negative flows really bothered me. So, okay, let's go on to the next slide. I'm now going to switch a little bit and talk about the willing seller design. And, there are a couple of features that, and they might not be intrinsic features. I'm going to talk about some of the issues and also how maybe they could be tweaked just a little bit to get rid of them. So, one of the issues I see is we don't change it slightly, when you got load shift CRRs, if you have to have a willing buyer for the source, and that's a utility generator, maybe, or contract to the utility, there might not be anybody else that wants to take that up. And, years ago, when we were talking about LMP with San Diego Gas and Electric and thinking about retail access, that was one of the things some of their executives pointed out before we did, that you don't want to lock people in. If you just shift around a set of CRRs, it locks the competitive retailers into the utilities generation. That really isn't a hedge. So that's something to think about whether we want to do that. Now, it seems to me that's not really intrinsic. There are things you could do to avoid that outcome. So one thing would be to continue to run an SFT auction, simultaneous feasibility conventional auction, but just allow load serving entities that have load shift, CRRs to offer them for sale in the auction and to offer to buy a CRR from a different source to the same sink. So that would be just like a reconfiguration auction for LSEs that got load shifts, and it wouldn't open it up to everybody, but it would enable a method for them to reconfigure their position to suit their needs when they get load shift CRRs. The second bullet there again is I don't see a way for entities in the EDAM to hedge day-ahead market congestion on the CAISO system, going back to the discussion this morning, if they're loop flows, if they expect loop flows in excess of their entitlement, there doesn't seem to be, because you're not going to have allocated CRRs to load serving entities that sink at the interties. But, another slight change to the design would be to still allow a general auction, but that only allowed bids to source at one intertie and sink at another. So it wouldn't be opening it up to everything, but it would allow entities that wanted to hedge congestion across the CAISO a mechanism for doing so, while you still have most of the action going on in the willing seller design. Go on to the next slide. I'll pause in a few minutes for comments, but I wanted to make a couple of points first. And this another issue is the potential for allocated CRRs to become counterflow CRRs as a result of change in market conditions. And there isn't really a good way for anybody to get out of that position unless somebody else wants to buy a sink at the same, a source at the same location. So, example of that is, January 2024, when again, it's Guillermo who did the analysis of all of the entities that switched out of their seasonal allocated CRRs that were sourced at Malin and sunk at various locations, and they were able to use the auction to get out of that and avoid large, payments in the day-ahead market. So it seems to me it'd be good to, that's a negative if we don't provide any mechanism for entities to do that. But again, I think you could still have an auction in which entities with allocated CRRs could put them in the auction either just to sell them or to buy a different source. So you'd still keep the sink at your load, but you'd switch from Malin to another source if it was simultaneously feasible. I mean, it'd have to be simultaneously feasible, but the issue is if it's perfectly feasible, why not let them switch out? And you could, put in bids for those who want to get out of that position more than others could pay more to get out of it, or maybe it wouldn't cost anything to get out of it. Guillermo's analysis suggested that, a lot of times the prices was very low to get out of those positions. So, it seems to me that that's consistent with still having a willing seller auction at the end, but allows some more flexibility for LSEs, whether they're internal or external, to adjust their hedges in a conventional auction that's based on what is the available transfer capability rather than restrictions about what happens to have been sold in the seasonal auction. Go to the next slide. Another look at this and the ability to get out of these positions is it's hard to know if you got to match up the source and sink. I can't get out of a particular source unless somebody else wants that source. And that's a limitation, that there might be plenty of transfer capability, but I can't get out of it because no one wants that source. And I think this, you can say, well, people can disclose in advance what they want to get rid of, and you don't want to put in bids for everything because then someone could end up with 50 positions when they wanted one. And you can't know what you want to submit a bid for unless you know exactly, what the prices are. So that's kind of difficult. But what I talked about before, over the previous few slides, is continuing to have a reconfiguration auction in which LSEs can get rid of inherited load shift CRRs, can reconfigure their allocated CRRs, and entities could buy, external entities could buy hedges across the system, would reduce the significance of this. I mean, it wouldn't be as liquid as the market is today, but at least we wouldn't be completely preventing those kind of transactions. So that's where I'm going to stop now and pause for comments, because I think that's a logically distinct point. So, Bill and Ben and Jim, do you have?
I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, I'll save mine for after my presentation.
Okay. Anybody in the room?
Anybody queued up?
Yes.
Yep, we do have one hand in the queue.
Great.
We have two hands in the queue. First to Mark Price. Your line is unmuted. You can go ahead.
Hey, this is Mark Price from DC Energy. You're able to hear me okay?
Yep.
So Scott, thanks for your analysis here. Wondering your thoughts on what the willing seller design, what would be the implications for price transparency in the auctions? I know you mentioned liquidity could be impacted, but is there any consequences to the price transparency we get from these auctions?
Well, I mean, there'd still be prices. I don't know what you mean by price transparency. Just there'd be potentially, but the DMMs rerun the models. We don't know all the prices, but that would be interesting to see. What were the prices coming out of there's a lot more. I don't want to speak to that because there's a lot more that could be put in the record to make those judgments. What were the prices coming out of the you know, not just the level, but the relative prices across the locations coming out of, you know, the simulations they run compared to the actual auctions. But there's still prices. There still would be prices in that. And if you had an initial auction in which LSEs could adjust their position, there'd be prices coming out of that. Now, there wouldn't be all the buyers and sellers, so there'd be some distortions in the prices, but that's something that could be, you know, looked into. Is there a second hand up, operator?
Our next hand is from Doug Boccignone. You can go ahead, sir.
Hi, Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Scott, thanks for your presentation. I appreciate it. On the wheel through concern, I mean, there is a mechanism for out of balancing authority area LSEs to, you know,
Right.
pay for the wheeling access charge to use the transmission, and then they're entitled to participate in the allocation process. I think, I don't know, what you might be pointing to is maybe that would be more expensive than they're willing to pay for the value of the hedge.
Right, right. I mean, that's the thing that's, you know, that was put in and I was involved in putting it in, but that was back when we had an auction. And that was to make sure we weren't giving stuff away at lower than the auction price. But now when we're talking about no auction, you know, puts a little different, you know, gloss on this. And I think people got to think about that, especially, you know, given the discussion this morning. Is that really what you want to say to FERC, that we're gonna charge for loop flow congestion, which I think we need to, at least for over, you know, some level of flows, but we're not gonna give any mechanism for entities outside the market to hedge other than paying the TAC for 8,760 hours a year, or half of that for off or on peak. I mean, I hear what you're saying, Doug, but I think you need to think about that.
No, I'm just reminding people that it does exist.
Yeah.
And I think sort of on a related point, I mean, there's this concept with EDAM for compensating the transmission owners or the EDAM entities for the lost transmission revenues that would have occurred, because these EDAM transfers, you know, won't be priced for the transmission usage. And I think if we are going to go down this path, it would need to be in conjunction with a sort of consideration of what is a reasonable payment for the lost wheeling out revenues that would be implied by this.
Well, I think the CAISO would still be charging for wheeling out. This would only be hedging congestion.
If it was an EDAM transfer, they wouldn't charge.
Oh, okay.
So I think we have to sort of think about some of those issues.
Okay.
Sorry on that. You mean if there is no congestion on the outflow anymore?
Well, whether or not
there wouldn't be an explicit.
Whether or not there's congestion, there won't be transmission charges for the transfers that go between the EDAM BAAs. You're right. If the transfer limit is binding, there'll be a sharing of the marginal energy cost differential between the source and sink EDAM entities.
Right, but the CAISO loads won't be paying, you know, charges in either, right? So
that's right. Well, they'll be paying for the CAISO transmission access charge.
right, but I mean, they won't be having to pay for the transmission on Pacific Corp. So, yeah, I
Right.
know that's a separate issue of, you know, the equities the various entities feel in that deal, and I don't want to speak to that. So that's up for them.
Yeah.
Are there other topics on this, points on this? I just got a couple more slides to go through and I'm done. Okay, go to the next slide. One point, you know, that we need to keep in mind is that the sales and the monthly, you know, it'd be very difficult for DMM and to go back and figure out which sales in the monthly auction were of CRRs that were acquired in the seasonal auction. So it's just everything. And we therefore don't know exactly if all the things that were offered in the monthly auction in the rerun model would actually be available in practice, because the entity selling them might not have been able to buy them in the seasonal auction to start with. So that doesn't mean that the monthly auction's meaningless. It just, you have to take a little grain of salt in it, because there might be, a lot less CRRs for sale in that auction, because a lot of them were CRRs that were acquired in the monthly auction that they wouldn't be able to acquire. But on the other hand, there are also entities, load serving entities that wait to reconfigure in the monthly auction. So, they need to have a mechanism to reconfigure. And the DMM does have one figure which breaks out the seasonal auction, which provides, and that given the way the CAISO runs it, there shouldn't be any, there weren't any resale of auction CRRs on that. It was only resale of allocated CRRs. So that's more of a pure calculation. Okay, I'm going to go on another couple slides and I'll stop again because then I'll be done. There's also some additional detail. There's a lot of detail that'd be good to have as we get further in the discussion, but a few just basic, simple things were to get a little more breakdown of the megawatt amounts cleared for financials, marketers, generators in the various types of auctions, and to break them down between positive and negative, because negatively priced CRRs back in this period were probably sales, and purchases were probably purchase of positive CRRs were probably really purchases, and then to see how it impacts the various types of LSEs would give us some big picture sense of this. Now it'd be good to go beyond the big picture and sort of look at this seasonal auction by seasonal auction and monthly auction by monthly auction to see the extent to which particular types of LSEs were able to get into or out of positions in a willing seller auction. But like a starting point would be some aggregate information. And of course, as I said, I think there are ways to allow more liquidity for LSEs to get out of position without necessarily going through the willing seller auction, but to have a transmission constraint auction that's open to LSEs that are reconfiguring their positions, as I discussed. Go to the next slide. And this is, I'm switching to talk about interties. And again, as I talked about with Doug, I think it's important to look at what the availability is of CRRs for entities that want to export or wheel through, and what's the volume specifically of CRRs available at the interties, that's sinking at the interties. And as I said, I think that, if there's a problem here, it could be solved by allowing bids from intertie to intertie. But it'd be interesting to look at this. And I think, again, it'd be good to rerun the first quarter 24 seasonal auction and monthly auction to look at, how many people would have been able to get out of those positions in a willing seller model. And I think that might, provide weight to what I talked about in terms of allowing LSEs an ability to buy and sell in an auction based on actual transmission constraints as well. So that if there's no transfer limit, constraint on getting out of that position, they should be able to. And I know there are problems in rerunning the model to get meaningful prices out of it after 2019, but I think just rerunning it and seeing what kind of volumes are available would be informative for some of these points. And now just take one more slide. This is just a clarification, because I found it really odd, particular tables in the report that seem to show that the financial participants were paid 55 million for taking on negatively priced CRRs, but that might have been sales, I don't know. And then they were required to pay 120 million in payouts, or alternatively, they gave up 120 million dollars in payouts. And it'd be good for DMM to provide more detail about that. What exactly is going on? Can they tell us, why these numbers came out that way? Because they seem odd to me. But maybe they're just because of back in those days, a negative was not really buying a negative. It was really selling a positive. But maybe just breaking it down more between the seasonal auctions and the monthly auctions would make this more intelligible for us. But that was just more clarity, I think, to understand what was going on.
So if I'm reading that correctly, couldn't that just be that they lost the speculative bet on that? On
Right,
those
but
type
I
of
don't, they
CRRs?
made a lot of money overall in the auction, so
They lost a lot,
I
yeah.
find it odd that I just don't believe they could have lost this much money. So maybe it's they didn't make this much money, maybe it's they sold, the negative was selling something and they sold it for less than it would have, but it's just hard to figure out. It's a little compact to understand what was going on and whether there's something we're all misunderstanding about the data. So I think given the situation, it'd be good to tease it out a little bit more for the readers. So I'll stop. That's the end, but let's go back and first, Ben and Jim, do you have any further thoughts about this?
Yeah, like I said, I'll probably circle back
Yeah,
when I
okay.
get to that.
Nothing to
Okay.
add now, perhaps after Jim's.
Yep, okay, fine. Then why don't we see if there's anybody on the in the room that would like to talk before we go to Jim's talk.
Seeing any hands up in the queue. Oh, we just had one hand go up. Dan Williams, your line is unmuted. You can go ahead.
Yeah, great presentation. It's Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. And I'm not sure, this is probably a question for Guillermo, but just in the discussion you're having around the shift factor thresholds, I'm just curious, is the default shift factor threshold for EDAM areas when they come in just going to stay at the 2%? And assuming that is what would you be looking for as a driver to consider getting sort of additional efficiency out of maybe moving that down to 0.2% or somewhere between there, as you did for the larger loads within California?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think when we implemented the enhancement in 2024, we let that item open for further discussion on how that would apply to the EDAM entities. I would say that it could make sense that we apply the same approach to any balancing area that is participating in the market because they are subject to the same type of congestion management. And right now, effectively, it's 2% across the system for individual locations, and it is 0.2% for the labs and trading hubs. So I think once we go with EDAM, there may be some reconciliation to see if we can just extend naturally that to the new entities.
Okay, and is that, I mean, just thinking somewhat speculatively back towards the discussion this morning, but if, I think that the Pac East load is somewhere in the like 13 to 15 gigawatt range if we're looking at the entire EDAM lap for Pac East as one load, at least on a peak basis. Someone will probably correct me on that, but it seems like if we're looking at impact on constraints in California, of that load, that lowering the shift factor on that may allow just more accurate accounting of its impacts when looking at the loop flow issues? Or am I thinking about that wrong?
Well, yeah, I think the premise of large aggregated locations having more meaningful impact on congestion relief just because of the size really doesn't distinguish what BA we're talking about. It's just a feature of the combination of shift factor and congestion relief. As long as you have these large aggregating locations, even if it is 6,000, 8,000 megawatts, that is just large enough that it's going to be much bigger than any individual generating resource. So the issue is still at hand, the same, that those aggregated locations, just by virtue of being aggregated, represent quite meaningful flow contributions, and therefore the reduced shift factor would make more sense to apply to them across the board.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. And probably something to follow up on in the future. And I guess it'd be hopeful as a market participant that if looking at that during market sim was possible, and it's a relatively light change to make from a either tariff or business practice perspective that would improve market outcomes, it'd be great to get that in even before market go live.
Point taken. Thank you, then.
So this is a stupid question, but I've been thinking about how the truncation works in the EIM. Then is there's no such thing as lapse in EIM because there's no bid in demand, or is the truncation the same?
Right. The demand in the real time is fixed, right? It's a forecast value, fixed value, rather than bidding demand. And we have,
but it's distributed in the network model in some way, I take it.
Yes. At the end, when you run the power flow, there is a distribution at individual level. And we did have this discussion as we approached the conclusion of the policy initiative, the enhancement that we did in 2024. And there was explicit discussion about the treatment of ELAPs in the EIM market or the EDAM market. At that point, the conclusion was that because this was an issue, strictly speaking, about the CRRs, it was limited to the CAISO footprint.
I see.
Yeah, but Guillermo, I don't think it's just about CRRs. I mean, it's also about whether generators are paid more than they're worth and whether loads are paying less than they should, or maybe more than they should if there's a counterflow. I mean, I think this is the CRR is just one manifestation, and maybe not the most important one, but it just, I think there's a broader impact. If these things are so big that they lead to all this shortfalls, it's maybe an impact on the pricing and generation as well.
Yeah, I understand that, Scott. It's a good point.
Okay. Let's see. Anybody else on the phone line? If not, we'll go to Jim.
I don't see anyone else on the phone line.
Okay. Thanks, Ben. So I can't even remember why I named this, gave this talk this title, but it's generic enough. So I've been kind of lurking on most of the CRR stakeholder calls over the last several months, and it's been a really informative, interesting discussion. And really, I think some of the stuff I wanted to talk about here were topics that I felt like were not getting enough play in those, or maybe they haven't yet. And maybe that's because people don't think them as important, but I kind of wanted to emphasize a few points that I felt like were missing from that discussion. So next slide, please. And basically, yeah, the first is going to be very preliminary discussion about, I mean, people definitely have talked about how important CRRs are, or how they're not that important. And I've been trying to sort of figure out ways to quantify some of this. And then I also wanted to go back and touch on just give an opinion on revenue adequacy and hedging values with a bit of an I told you so flavor to it. And then I want to talk about the allocation process, which I really think is something that has not been given enough play, and especially in the context of if we go to willing, at some point, was it called willing buyer, willing seller? For some reason, I had that name in my head. Now, apparently, it's willing seller or willing counterparty. So I have WBWS in here, but I'm talking about the DMM willing seller proposal there. Next slide, please. Okay, so I talk a lot to economists and policymakers in other industries, and it's always interesting and actually educational to try to explain electricity market issues to people who don't work in electricity. And the challenge when it comes to CRRs is sort of, you know, ramped up above most other things, but it's still kind of useful. And trying to explain sort of what a CRR is and how it might be useful as hedging kind of has forced me to, you know, to explain or confront a couple things here. So, you know, in terms of general commodity market trading, we think of basis risk as this sort of difference between either the location or some other dimension of a standardized contract and the thing you really want to buy. And so in this case, it's locational. It could be some other, you know, characteristic, but and the CRR we think of as a way of trying to hedge that basis risk, or it's one potential use of it. And you know, really though, if you're thinking of a CRR that you're buying in an auction monthly, or maybe seasonally, so then it's 3 months. I'm sort of emphasizing the month to month here. You know, what you can do is hedge your hourly volatility over the course of a month, but you're paying some value for it. You're paying a fixed amount, and you're avoiding having to pay for the risk of hour to hour volatility within a peak or off peak sort of definition. There's also month to month volatility, which maybe you could hedge 3 months worth, you know, in a seasonal CRR. But really, there's also this long run trends in congestion costs. And next slide, this is where it's kludgy to do this, not by my own. Hourly is really what the CRRs that we sell does. And I think when we talk about the hedging risk, one of the issues I've been trying to confront is, you know, how much value really is there in sort of every month having to buy a CRR that allows you to hedge, you know, the intra-month risk. But then if you have a really bad, if you learn that month that congestion is just going to be bad from now on that particular, you know, relevant pair of nodes, then, you know, you're paying a higher monthly price from then on. And you're able to sort of hedge that hourly volatility, but you're not really hedging the longer run risk by having to buy it again and again every month or every season. And so next slide, when we, you know, when people like Steve Stoft, when we shared an office, you know, we talk about how CRRs can be useful for investment. You know, we always thought about the kind of long run trend risk where you make a long run investment in an immobile, you know, durable asset that's hundreds of millions of dollars, and the risk is that the congestion pattern is going to change over the course of years and make, you know, what looked like a pretty good location look pretty bad by the end of those trends. And locking in those types of being able to hedge that type of risk helps in what Steve called bankability and allegedly trying to get, you know, financing for investments and those sorts of things. But only long-term CRRs really deal with that sort of long-term trend. And I've heard the flavor of this from people in the stakeholder meetings that you know, there isn't a liquid market for long-term CRRs. Really, the amount of discussion given to the long-term CRR allocation process, how they're traded, even how many of them, there really hasn't been much information that I've been able to find on them. And even the business practice manual is pretty sparse in terms of how this process works. And it just seems to me that when we talk about hedging value, the long term, or at least medium term, is sort of pretty important, and we haven't really given it much, if any, attention in sort of this process. I at least would like to know a little bit more about how much of the current allocations are, you know, chewed up by long term, how those are playing out. And you know, then that goes back to the earlier point I was making about how much value really is there in the ability to nominate or the right to purchase or the opportunity to purchase a sequence of monthly CRRs if really the risk we're facing is multi-year sort of shifts or trends in congestion patterns. And so when we talk about the value of running a monthly CRR auction, how real is that in terms of financing investment when what we might really need is something of much longer duration? All right, next slide. So in order to try to, I've been working with a finance professor now because I'm not a finance guy, and just trying to sort of think through a few things about CRRs in the context of these discussions, but also I've just been curious about it. And so in the process here, I've been working with the just under 8,000 CRR node pairs where they were selected based upon the 3 years of auctions and allocations from 22 to 24, where anything that got more than 50 megawatt months of auction or allocation is sort of what I would call a popular CRR. Now there's some of those in the tens of thousands, so there's some that are really, you know, have a lot of volume, and a bunch that have only about 50. But basically what I've been trying to think through is for all these CRRs, how would a conventional financial modeling approach represent the risk inherent in this if you were either an entity that was just buying them purely speculatively, just to use one extreme kind of end of this, you wouldn't want to buy it at the expected value because you would get no expected return and you'd be taking on a whole bunch of risk. And so we wouldn't expect anybody to actually bid their expected value as a pure speculator here. And conversely, wouldn't expect anybody who's in a purely financial position, doesn't have an underlying physical position, to offer a CRR at expected value either, because they would be taking on a bunch of risk to do so. And so basically, I've been trying to talk to people about what types of financial models can sort of, with empirical measures of the risk, sort of quantify that risk return trade-off that might be considered reasonable, and how it compares to other financial instruments. We got down a ways down. I didn't want to get into this because it's all preliminary. Interest rate swaps are sort of a model that seems comparable to what CRRs do, except interest rate swaps and other sorts of instruments are true derivatives where there are actually some really liquid markets for the underlying commodities that can then be sliced up into the derivatives. And what's special about CRRs is that there really isn't anybody who has the counterposition for the congestion between two nodes, unless they're like really liquid hubs, except the one who's running the market. And so that does make this a little difficult to compare to other financial instruments. So what I'm going to show you here are just a few pictures that illustrate a couple points. I will say that sort of just trying to look at this relative to what other types of financial instruments say, it's like, well, there is a lot of volatility here. It's a lot of risk. So if you really were in a purely financial position, you would expect to charge a pretty big premium to offer this kind of thing if you had no other way of trying to offload that risk. But that's all preliminary. Okay, so next couple slides, or next slide, please. Oh yeah, okay, I threw this in at the last minute. This is, I think, the top 10 in terms of the volumes by my measure of CRRs over the course of 2022 to 24. It might not be the right pure measure of popularity, but in terms of megawatts requested in a sequence of allocations and auctions, Tracy Captain Jack was the most popular. Really what I'm trying to highlight here is that the mean congestion, and the statistics here are all monthly returns. So within a month, you're seeing a lot of volatility, as the pictures will show on daily returns. But, from month to month, the mean over 7 years, there's a couple here that are up over $4. And there are a bunch that are under $1 in terms of congestion cost. And the mean marginal cost of energy is 51 here. So that might look like congestion is a pretty small chunk here, but these averages are averaging out some pretty big swings in both directions. So for example, the Sylmar DLAP Edison goes from a month at -15 to a month at plus 18, for example, where the 5th and 95th are, again, monthly congestion costs over the course of 7 years. So whatever the 5th percent of 7 times 12 is. This is a monthly congestion cost on each of these. So a lot of these are reflecting some pretty big swings from positive to negative that sort of balance out to give rather small mean congestions. Whether we consider that big or not is sort of, I think I'd like to hear people's opinions on. And I'd like to compare this to sort of the risk of, say, natural gas in terms of how meaningful this can be. All right, next slide, please. All right, so these are daily returns now over 7 years, where the black line, it's kind of hard to see. That's the monthly values, such as what were summarized in the previous slide. Again, this is, by my measure, the most popular CRR in terms of allocation and auction in terms of megawatts. And there was a month of big negative. A lot of, again, the means are not huge, but you do see months where you have some pretty big negative and positive values. And then within those, they are really driven by some days and hours with really, really extreme congestion costs. And I'm actually truncating this picture at 300 because just to keep the scale from masking any information. And so if we did this hourly, we would see some really massive volatility. And one of the issues that I keep wrestling with and talking to people about is the right measure of volatility to think of the hour-to-hour variance in prices, or if it's because you're basically stuck absorbing that CRR over the course of the whole month. Is it really the monthly return that's the more relevant number? Okay, so this is Tracy, Captain Jack. Next slide, please. This is the second most popular. Note the axis scale here on the y-axis is much smaller, so it looks more volatile, but it actually isn't. This is notable, Palo Verde, Edison. One of the things that jumped out here that I think Ben picked up on too is that this highlights that you kind of see this trend over the 7 years where the congestion's going from positive to negative by the end of this time series. And when we think about long-term risk, that's the kind of thing that somebody might really worry about if you're making a long-run generation investment. Next slide, please. This is actually, I think it's the 10th or 13th most popular. So but we've been talking a lot about the Northwest. And so here you see a similar sort of trend where the spikes were all positive early on. They go negative, and this is part of, I think, Guillermo's case study where we had these really big high prices in the Pacific Northwest in early 2024, and that's influencing this particular CRR as well. All right, so that's just some illustrations. I'm trying to do some quantifications to compare these to other financial instruments, but I didn't want to present it here because I'm still kind of learning this stuff myself. All right, next slide, please. Okay, now here's my I told you so moment, which isn't really helpful for anybody but me, maybe. In 2018, we had an MSC meeting. It was one of our last in-person meetings. Well, I guess we went through 2020, but I remember it because I don't do a lot of presentations at meetings, and I gave this presentation about CRRs when we were talking about Phase 1B. And I expressed concern that the proposal for how we're going to haircut the values of CRRs just is so unpredictable that it would significantly devalue CRRs as hedging instruments, that there'd be a lot of payment uncertainty. And I really, worried at the time that we'd be devaluing these things so much that it's not clear what the purpose of selling them would be anymore. No one at the time said anything when I gave this presentation. None of the stakeholders seemed to agree with me. Now, Mark Smith, I think, was on the phone, but his phone dropped because of a bad connection, and he was trying to agree with me, I think. But so these concerns do seem to have materialized, though. I'm hearing a lot more recently that, that it is very unpredictable. In part, I think it's because the magnitude of the revenue inadequacy has been so larger than anybody expected, perhaps, that these, adjustments on top of that, which are very targeted, have made these things very volatile. But one, point I wanted to highlight was when you see these summary stats about the auction efficiency, or so this should say auction efficiency, they often talk about how, oh yeah, this this haircut adjustment to the payouts to CRRs has increased the auction efficiency. But that's because you're using the amount people have paid for auctions and comparing it to the haircut payouts. But really, what we would want to know is what people would have paid for these CRRs if we weren't giving these kinds of haircuts, because presumably the unpredictable nature of the payouts to the CRRs is having some effect on how much people are willing to pay to buy them. And so we don't really know exactly how the phase 1B effects targeting revenue insufficiency really have interplayed with auction efficiency in my mind. But I do think that we went too far there. That I think trying to make what you buy more reliable as a hedging instrument, that if it comes at the cost of just selling less of them because we're worried about revenue insufficiency or other things, then fine. But I think it's better to sell lower quantities of high quality CRRs rather than, and this is all sort of, qualitative, larger quantities of low quality CRRs. And if we do have any remaining, ideally we would really identify the sources of revenue insufficiency that we talked about in the first half of this section, and really reduce the revenue insufficiency. But what's left, hopefully, if it is a small residual amount, that I think we should seriously talk about what I would consider true pro rata, which is just taking every CRR and reducing it based upon the shortfall, rather than targeting individual CRRs based upon some measure of which interf ties they're drawing from. Would reduce the uncertainty of the payout risk associated with any individual CRR. All right, third topic, please. Next slide. Okay, so allocation. There are, and I guess the point here is that if we are pursuing options along the lines of willing seller, this really raises the stakes of the allocation process, because it becomes the main mechanism for which CRRs are basically put out into the world. That rate, and therefore, I think we need to be, giving a lot more scrutiny to how the auction allocation process, the allocation process is working. Is it equitable? Is it efficient? Because the current allocation process uses, my understanding, a megawatt-based approach. That just you can identify kind of intuitively some potential inefficiencies there, like you might overload your megawatts on valuable lines rather than lines that you really need to try to capture pro rata reductions. And going back to the earlier point, I'm still not clear on how long-term rights play into these allocation outcomes either. I'd like to know more information about that. And then there's these questions about how the allocation process would interact with the willingness to sell. What are the incentives of firms, in different types of firms, even in the allocation process? Are they seeking out the highest expected value CRRs to then turn around and sell? Would they do so more under a willing seller design? Are they really focused on trying to identify the best hedge to their market exposure? And how do regulated entities or unregulated LSEs balance these considerations? And then there's this issue of counterflow, where you might actually have a hedge position that would require that you take on an expected negative value CRR, but you don't want to do that in an allocation process, because you'd basically be taking on something that is of expected negative value. In an auction, you could be paid to take that on, and it would help hedge your position. But in an allocation setting, there isn't that sort of option. And I'll come back to this. It's sort of just, I think there should be a discussion about how regulatory oversight and guidance impacts both the first phase of CRR allocations and then the willingness to sell them in the auction. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is paraphrasing. Nobody said this explicitly, but I'm sort of caricaturing two extreme ends of the spectrum of like what I've heard of the debates on CRRs in California. One is sort of a purist view that, oh, even if we just eliminated CRRs altogether, financial markets would just step in and we could buy them. I think that from, again, very preliminary, so I don't want to die on that hill, but it looks like these things are, specific point to point, pretty volatile. And so the cost of buying it from a purely financial player with no ability to offload that risk could be as high or higher as what we see, sort of the discount, the prices we're seeing in the current auction clearing. Now, the arguments have been made that, oh, well, you don't really need to buy your specific point-to-point CRR. You could just sort of buy at one liquid trading hub, take a long position and take a short position at another liquid trading hub. And yeah, there'll be some remaining basis risk, but it won't be significant. I'm willing to entertain that, but I haven't looked at sort of how liquid those hubs are and how much remaining basis risk there might be for specific entities. This is not even getting into sort of the important questions of whether we need to slice these CRRs in a better time of day, sort of notions to better fit the increasing need for variable energy resources to acquire them. Okay, so that's one extreme, which is like, we can just get rid of CRRs, financial markets will take care of it. I'm not really convinced by that. The other extreme is that, the willing seller proposal is equivalent to just eliminating all CRRs from the market. And I think it's just, it's been pointed out, but it doesn't eliminate conventional CRRs. What it really does is sort of creates the sequence where CRRs would be available, but they are available at the behest of LSEs, first getting them and then being willing to sell them. And so it does, again, put more weight and importance on the allocation process, which has always been important, but I think has been a little understudied here. And I would phrase there's two sets of issues associated with this. It's not like there are no CRRs being made available to the market, but they are flowing through the LSEs. And so how many fewer overall CRRs would be available if we maybe upped the capacity in the allocation auction, but the allocation phase, but then adopted a willing seller sort of issue. And Scott kind of highlighted this, that under one, I think, literal version, as I understand it, of the willing seller proposal, we'd be limited to the sources and sinks that are awarded in the allocation process, because everybody sort of has to bid for those specific locations. Scott used the phrase reconfigure auction a couple times, and I think trying to explore whether there are ways to do that, kind of the spirit of reconfiguration, where you're not literally transacting at the exact same nodes and the exact same volumes, but capturing some notion of the capacity of the network. Maybe there are some ways to try to balance that. So that's the first set of issues, is sort of how, would there really be, or how many fewer CRRs would be available? Does that actually help revenue inadequacy to the degree where we can make the remaining CRRs more reliable? Is that even better? But I think those are all sort of issues we need to work through. The second set of issues are sort of this question of, okay, well, if it does go to LSEs first, then what do we think of any frictions that might exist in terms of the ability, willingness of LSEs to sell to anybody else who might want them or need them? And I know different parties with different positions have different opinions about this. But I think this is, a question that needs to be asked about exactly how the incentives and the willingness and the regulatory barriers and other barriers that might exist to the ongoing sale of CRRs or even if we're bundling a CRR with, say, a power purchase agreement and the LSC controls it, how exactly that affects the dynamic of the market is something that we're going to have to confront. Okay, so that's the end of my thoughts. Plenty to discuss there. So I'll open it up for reactions.
Plenty to discuss. 10 minutes left unless we go into overtime and penalty kicks. Scott, anything you want to add to?
I've talked enough. Let's turn it to the people in the room.
We do have one hand up from Michelle Keto. Michelle, you can go ahead.
That's great. Hello, Michelle.
Hey, sorry, this is not my area of expertise, so this question might be off base, but one is just a technical question. I thought that the willing buyer, willing seller didn't require, allowed the allocations to occur, but it wasn't that the allocations then got sold. It just is if you had matching counterparties. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you basically would offer, if you didn't want to keep them as an LSE, you could offer them into a secondary auction. And I guess there would have to be somebody who wants not necessarily the exact opposite, because I think the general idea is there would be, a pool of LSEs that are offering a collection of sources and sinks. And so you could have like 6 LSEs offering 6 different nodes, and they don't have to match exactly, as long as sort of in toto they add up together.
It's funny, I was thinking of it differently. So I was thinking of this as like financial markets allowing for the trading, but there's the auction at the beginning. But I'll just have to clarify that. And then, so my second question is, I've really struggled with this because, hedging is usually never costless, right? So you go out and you try to do a hedge, and the counterparties are banks, and they're saying, that's going to cost you. And, it can be very expensive to hedge. And so what I struggle with here is that this isn't we aren't giving out costless hedges. We're actually giving out profitable hedges. So what am I missing?
Well, yeah. So I guess another way to put it is, it seems like the demand, the hedging demand, where you'd expect them to be paying a premium relative to the expected value, doesn't seem to be strong enough to be driving the prices up, and that the remaining demand is speculative, where it does seem like to take on some of these purely speculatively, I'm not sure exactly. You certainly don't want to pay 100% of the expected value, and maybe 2/3 is about what you would end up paying. So yeah, the question is, why isn't there more speculative or hedging demand? And people have argued, well, maybe there just isn't that much hedging that's being done with these. Maybe a monthly instrument isn't that useful as a hedge. I'd like to sort of get some reactions to that.
But if it's the owner, California Load is the owner of the transmission, and I sort of think of like, I go to a bank, a trader, and I say I want to hedge, and they're like, that's going to cost you a lot of money. But here we're saying, let's go to Load and ask them to be the counterparty for this hedge. And they should say no, right? Because they should say that's going to cost you a lot of money. But here we say we're going to have a $0 reservation price. Doesn't that not make sense? We're not letting Load act like the counterparty to these hedges. So of course it's lucrative, right?
Well, I think the argument DMM has put forward is that the LSEs, or sorry, Load is being pushed into the counterparty role, but because these are being offered at zero price, they're not able to charge that premium that you're referring to.
Right.
And you would, if there was enough demand, hedging demand, you would expect that premium to just come out, whether it was offered in at zero or whatever. And one option we've talked about in the past is that you don't have a zero reservation price. You have something that's non-zero. Of course, there's a broad spectrum there. And I think willing seller is, well, I'm not sure where that falls in that spectrum. But it's sort of limiting the, or giving that reservation price a little bit more over to what the LSCs sort of decide they want it to be. But of course, the PUC would play the role there, at least for the regulated LSCs as well.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
I'm not sure how that discussion plays out, honestly.
Yeah, yeah. Except that we aren't the willing seller, right? We're just the counterparty to this $0
Yeah, and I mean, it's
reservation
because
price. And then,
load pays a TAC, and
right.
so TAC. But you know, it's my memory of how we got here is that, well, one of the reasons why load pays a TAC instead of generation, and there was a big debate over whether both should pay it or one or the other, is that, you know, we thought load was less elastic and less likely to distort its sort of positions in the market in the face of attack. I'm not sure that's true anymore. But it really wasn't sort of this notion of load should own the transmission.
So, I mean, so going at the CRRs, was it always a hedging or was it a return of the congestion rents?
Well, it was both. That the idea of this idea is that the congestion revenue, like what we saw in those pictures, is this stream that's sometimes really big, sometimes really small. You could just send it back to the load, or you could just send it anywhere you want. It's sort of a, you know, it's basically a tax that's being collected. It also actually just happens to match the positions that certain entities in the market face in the opposite way. And so they are, the collection of the congestion rents happens to exactly inversely mirror the positions that people paying those rents are exposed to. And so there is an idea of returning the rents from those congestion revenues is a way of providing those hedges while actually reducing the volatility of the revenue stream being collected in the form of congestion revenues, and reducing the volatility of the congestion payments that those using the network have to pay. So I think it does reduce the volatility to both sides, but it comes at this cost of, at least in California, of continually selling it at 2/3 the value.
Yeah, and if you looked and said, oh, wow, the LSCs are using these to hedge, that would be one thing. But that's not really what we see, right? I mean,
Yes. Well, I'd like to know more about that. I mean, if they are not using it to hedge and no one's using it to hedge, again, maybe these aren't just like these aren't designed in a way that provides as much value as a hedge as they should be. And maybe there are ways to improve that that would also both increase their value and maybe reduce some of these auction losses that we've been talking about.
okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle.
We have a couple more hands up in the queue. Doug Boccignone, your line is unmuted. You can go ahead.
Thank you. Doug Boccignone for BAMX. In terms of whether the CRRs are being used as a hedge, I think allocation CRRs are typically used as hedges. As the auction CRRs, I think mostly are not. And, you know, the data we've looked at for 2024 shows that about 80% of all the CRRs that were auctioned in 2024 were held by entities that reportedly, you know, transacted actual physical energy. In California, only about 1%, actually less than 1% of the energy in California. So, you know, to me, this suggests that these aren't at least directly being used as hedges by the vast majority of the CRRs that are sold in the auction. So,
Doug, can you say that again? 80%?
Okay. 80% of the auction CRRs, and we consider buys and sells, but I think you get a similar conclusion if you only consider the buys. And we compared that to the FERC EQR data, which are sales in California. And granted, some entities don't have to report sales, so we're probably understating the size of the market. But looking at the EQR data, that 70% of the CRRs were held by parties who reported no sales and were shown as not shown as a buyer on any of the sellers' reports. And then 80% overall. I mean, there's some in there that have a really minuscule amount of energy that's being transacted. And then, then there's a bunch that are, there's CRRs being sold by CCAs that have, inherited load migration CRRs that don't match up with their positions, so they sell them. And in some cases, then they buy to sort of rebalance their position. But so I think we really need to focus on, like, what are these CRRs being used for? Because I think it's really important to step back and say, if we didn't have CRRs or we didn't auction any CRRs, the congestion revenue would be returned to the people who pay the transmission access charge. And it's this, the problem we have with the auction is it's forcing those parties to sell with a $0 reservation price. And it doesn't look, I'm having a hard time understanding how the market as a whole is benefiting from that forced auction sale. And it just doesn't, it seems unlikely that we're getting as much in return, even when you take a, Jim, your analysis of the risks that people are taking. I mean, they're taking some risk, but they're consistently making money. I mean, occasionally they lose a little bit of money, but over time they make money. And what are we getting for it? I know what they're getting for it, but what's the market overall getting for it?
Yeah, that's the kind of question we're trying to answer, or at least frame here. And yeah, I'd like to follow up with you offline and dig more into your analysis. And also, just have you done? I don't know how much you've looked at the allocation side of it. But I'd also be sort of interested in that. I guess one of the main points I'm trying to make from all this is, if we do get rid of the second auction, or we substantially reorient it, I think that we really need to think about how what remains is transferred into the market and the market participants. Whether that means we are running the allocation phase more like an auction. And I think that's sort of the direction I would like to see it go, rather than just sort of a megawatt nomination, something where there is more of a value-based bid associated with them. And how those revenues would then be distributed, maybe that's a whole other discussion, but I can imagine, I think anything that substantially modifies what we now call the auction needs to think holistically about what the first phase that we now call the allocation phase should look like. And I will say that, one of the arguments I've heard about, so there's a concern that if you just give the LSEs all of the CRRs, that they won't sell them. And I think that's something that should be discussed, but the argument's also been made, well, the PUC doesn't allow regulated utilities to hold on to CRRs either. And so they have to sell them. But then, are they willing sellers?
Yeah, and I
Uh,
don't think the
so
DMM was actually proposing to change the allocation process, other than they pointed out that you could allocate more CRRs if you didn't have the auction,
yeah, no, I
and
don't think they were
you wouldn't
either.
have to have
I,
the
yeah,
offset.
I'm not saying they are. I'm saying I am. I think we should be looking at the allocation process as part of this willing seller discussion, because I think it will be all that's left in a sense. And I think it becomes that much more important to understand how it's working now and whether it needs to be modified if we do go down that road.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, Doug.
We have one more hand up in the queue from Jordan Miner. You can go ahead.
Hi, thank you. This is Jordan Miner from the CPUC Energy Division. I appreciate the presentation today. I just have a couple questions on MSC's opinion on this. Would willing buyer, willing seller work to solve the revenue inadequacy or come close to it? Or are there other market fixes that we can do to get closer to revenue sufficiency? This is not clear to me based on discussions we had on other CAISO initiative calls. There's a lot of analysis done regarding the inadequacy, but I'm not sure there's a solution that brings us really close to revenue neutral at least. And then finally, would netting the auction revenue be sufficient to cover auction losses like in other ISOs?
So I guess on your first question, the willing buyer, willing seller isn't really addressing revenue inadequacy in the sense that the revenue inadequacy from the payouts to CRRs on any given day might be greater than the amount collected by running the market in terms of congestion revenues on that day. And so they've been kind of related, but all the issues that I talked about with kind of haircutting the payouts to CRRs are targeting the revenue inadequacy problem. But the auction efficiency problem is the one that willing buyer, willing seller is trying to address. And whether that eliminates it, I think it assumes that there'll be an allocation, and then the LSEs will then sell some of those allocated CRRs in a secondary process. Maybe it's a reconfigure auction, or maybe it's just based on the sources that were allocated in sinks. If those are sold in that second phase at a loss, it doesn't eliminate what we would call auction inefficiency. I think the only way to completely eliminate it might be to have no CRRs and just pay pro rata load the congestion rents every day, which is not something that I don't think anybody has proposed. So does that answer your first question? I wasn't clear if you were asking about revenue insufficiency specifically, or whether you meant auction efficiency.
I mean auction efficiency coming from the revenue shortfall and the auction losses.
Yeah. Okay. So that, I think it kind of depends on what the LSEs then do with if they're willing. If they don't sell anything, then I guess that would reduce what we call auction inefficiency, but it creates a bunch of other issues in the sense of other people who want to get access to CRRs wouldn't be able to get them. If they do sell them, then the question becomes, okay, at what price are they selling them? What are the incentives that like you guys are giving regulated utilities for selling them? And they could very well end up selling them at a loss. Guillermo's shown that like a lot of seasonal CRRs are turned around and sold. People buy the seasonal CRRs at a discount, and then they turn around and sell them monthly at a profit. I think that was the arbitrage category that Guillermo was highlighting. And so there's definitely some interplay there where he didn't break that down between allocated and non-allocated, but it wouldn't you know, it all depends on what the willing sellers end up selling at.
Thank you. And then my second question was about netting auction revenue. Would that be sufficient to cover auction losses like in other ISOs, or do we not have enough extra revenue if we netted it to cover the losses?
So I'm not sure what netting auction revenue. Do you guys, anybody else? So there's there's sort of like a netting of congestion revenues that on the revenue insufficiency side, you know, the ISO runs a market, it collects a bunch of congestion revenue by selling at expense, you know, selling at high prices at load nodes and buying at low prices at generation nodes. It collects a bunch of congestion rent. It pays that out every day in CRRs, and it shouldn't, you know, Bill Hogan told us it shouldn't be insufficient, but it turns out the real world makes it more complicated. When there's more CRRs out there, then there turns out there is transmission capacity in a way, and a bunch of other complications feed in. So one way to deal with that is to just sort of look at the total amount of congestion revenue that CAISO collects, or an ISO collects, and then the total amount of money you owe to CRR holders, and do that every day. And there's ways to net that. The ISO doesn't do that, is my understanding. It sort of looks CRR by CRR, whether that CRR is sort of short or not, and it doesn't use other parts of the network that are collecting a surplus to offset the shortfalls that other CRRs are experiencing. That's my understanding on the revenue insufficiency side. And so that might be what you mean by the netting. I'm not sure what auction netting would be.
That's what I mean, James.
Okay, yeah, and so I do think that would, you know, I haven't seen the numbers on exactly how much extra is collected on the surplus side. I guess we have seen the numbers, but I can't remember what the totals end up looking like. Partha, do you have an answer to that?
The total, Jim, still would be a deficiency. The surplus helps, but doesn't eliminate the deficiency.
Right, but I mean, what percentage are we talking about? Is it like 10%, or would it eliminate half the deficiency, or?
Yeah, I don't have a number. I would have to run it, but we have posed those numbers in dollar-wise, not percentage-wise.
Right, and so Jordan, that one of the things I was talking about is, you know, one way to do this is you just look at the total shortfall, and it's, you know, I don't know what, $1,000 in this hour, and if there are 1,000 CRRs allocated, you just cut everybody by $1. And you don't do any kind of specific identifying of which CRR has, you know, is associated with more of a revenue shortfall than any other. And so it would reduce the haircuts. It would also, you know, as a result, increase payouts to the CRRs, though. And so it kind of depends on which side of this you are as to whether you like that or not. I think, again, I would rather see the CRRs be of higher quality and we just sell less of them if that's sort of the trade-off that we have to make in order to guarantee revenue sufficiency.
Thank you so much. It's interesting to hear all your responses to these questions.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you, Jordan. It is 3:15. I'll check to see if there are any last questions. If there are, I hope they're quick.
We don't have any other questions in the attendee queue.
Okay. Thank you very much, Silas, for monitoring that, and to the ISO staff and to Jim and Scott for the presentations and for responding so thoughtfully to the questions that we've had in the comments. There's always the last agenda item, which is any other business.
And I think in my 20-odd years here, I've never heard of other business being raised at this last item. But I do have to ask. Jim, Scott, anything else you want to say?
You're really tempting fate there, Ben, but no.
Okay. And I promise no more bad metaphors about extra time or extra innings or anything else, even though the baseball season is starting. And I know Jim is a big fan. So
not when my team left my city. Sorry.
Aren't they closer to you now for the
They're
next
not
couple
my
of
team
years?
anymore.
Oh, all right. Anyway, so thanks everybody for joining us. Wish you a good weekend. At the moment, we don't have another meeting planned, but I'm sure there'll be one soon, as well as opinions under development. So, Silas, I think we can sign off now.
All right. Thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. With that, our call is concluded, and you may now disconnect.